Rain came down over Brooklyn like judgment, hammering the black roof of the Vitale mansion until the gutters screamed. Inside, in a nursery painted the colour of a robin's egg, a 3-year-old boy named Enzo Vitale slept with his small fist curled around a stuffed wolf. He did not wake when the side door off the kitchen garden clicked open. He did not wake when 4 men in rain-slicked coats moved through the house with the silence of men who had done this kind of work before, stepping over the unconscious body of a nanny who had only turned her back for a moment, only a moment, to answer the intercom. He woke only when a gloved hand closed over his mouth and he was lifted into the storm. 2 floors below, Damiano Vitale was standing in his study with a phone pressed to his ear, listening to a shipment report from Newark when the first scream tore through the house. By the time he reached the nursery, taking the stairs 3 at a time with his weapon already drawn, the window was open, the curtains were soaked through, and the crib was empty. He would remember for the rest of his life the exact texture of that silence. The wolf dropped on the wet windowsill, the rain indifferent, his own voice roaring his son's name into a night that gave nothing back. They searched for 6 years. Damiano spent a fortune that would have built hospitals. He turned over half the eastern seaboard, burned bridges with the Calabrese family, bribed detectives, hired trackers who specialized in things the police could not touch, and buried 3 men with his own hands when the trail of blood the kidnappers left behind finally led somewhere. But the boy himself was never found. The men responsible, it turned out, had been paid by someone inside his own organization, someone close enough to know which door in the garden wall didn't lock properly, someone who bled that knowledge out under Damiano's questioning before a bullet ended the conversation permanently. But knowing who had ordered the crime didn't return the child. The kidnappers panicked, it seemed, when the ransom drop went wrong. A rival crew tried to intercept the handoff. In the chaos, the child was abandoned, left, according to one dying man's confession, in a stairwell somewhere in Queens, with no name, no papers, and no way for a frightened 3-year-old to tell anyone who his father was. By the time Damiano's men found that stairwell, it led nowhere. The boy who had once been Enzo Vitale had already vanished into the vast, anonymous machinery of New York's foster system. One more small body, swallowed by paperwork, renamed by strangers, sent from one temporary bed to the next. 6 years became 10. 10 became 13. Damiano Vitale, in that time, became something the city whispered about rather than spoke of aloud. He inherited his father's empire, shipping routes, real estate fronts, a controlling interest in half the nightclubs south of 14th Street, and he ran it with a precision that had no patience left for softness. Men who crossed him disappeared quietly. Men who served him loyally were rewarded generously. He was, by the time he turned 34, one of the 5 most powerful men in the American underworld, and one of the coldest. He never remarried the idea of love. He never spoke his son's name aloud, not once in 13 years. Though he kept the stuffed wolf in a drawer in his penthouse office, and every year on the anniversary of the kidnapping, he locked his door and did not come out until morning. The city called him the Winter King. His own capos called him, only ever behind his back, l'uomo di ghiaccio, the man of ice. What none of them knew what not even Damiano himself could have imagined on that ruined night with rain in his hair and his son's name dying in his throat, was that somewhere across the East River, in a run-down building that smelled of bleach and instant coffee, a 24-year-old pediatric nurse named Elena Marchetti was about to walk into street Agnes Children's Home to volunteer an extra shift because she couldn't stand the thought of the little boy in room 6 spending another Christmas Eve alone. She did not know his name was Enzo. She would come to call him Nico. She had no idea as she pushed open that squeaking door with a paper bag of second-hand toys under her arm that she was walking into the centre of a war that had never really ended. Only gone quiet, waiting, the way storms wait behind a clear sky. The boy was sitting cross-legged on a cot too small for him, hollow-eyed, refusing to speak to any of the staff, refusing even to eat unless someone sat with him. He had been at St. Agnes for 8 months already, moved there after his 3rd failed foster placement, marked in his file with the phrase that broke Elena's heart every time she read it. Attachment difficulties, likely trauma-related, origin unknown. She sat down on the floor across from him, not on the cot, not looming, just sitting where he could see her whole body and know she wasn't coming closer without permission. She unpacked the paper bag, a wooden train with chipped paint, a picture book about a lighthouse, a single, slightly bent chocolate bar she'd bought with her own grocery money. "You don't have to talk to me," she said softly. "I'll just sit here a while, if that's okay." He watched her for a long time with eyes the colour of dark honey. Eyes that, had Damiano Vitale been in that room, he would have recognized instantly, because they were his mother's eyes, passed down through blood to a son he would not see again for 13 years. The boy said nothing, but when Elena stood to leave 2 hours later, promising to come back the next day, his small hand closed around the hem of her cardigan and would not let go. "Okay," she whispered, sitting back down. "Okay, I'm not going anywhere." She had no way of knowing that sentence would define the next 13 years of her life. She had no idea that the boy clutching her sleeve was heir to one of the most dangerous fortunes in America, hunted by enemies who wanted him dead so he could never grow up to reclaim it, protected, though she did not know this either, by a father who had never once stopped looking. All she knew was that a child needed her, and she would not let him go. Elena Marchetti had grown up in Bensonhurst, in a house full of noise. 3 brothers, a father who ran a hardware store, a mother who died of a stroke when Elena was 19, and left behind an emptiness that never fully closed. She became a nurse because she'd spent so many nights in hospital waiting rooms as a teenager, watching her mother's body fail in slow motion, that she'd promised herself she would learn to be useful in exactly that kind of moment. She specialized in pediatrics because children, she believed, deserved to be protected from a world that was often careless with them. She had not planned on adopting anyone. She had not planned on much of anything beyond finishing her shifts, paying her rent on a 1-bedroom walk-up in Astoria, and maybe, someday, falling in love with someone steady and kind and utterly unremarkable. Life, as it turned out, had other plans. It took 4 months of visits, every day after her hospital shift, sometimes twice a day on weekends, before the boy spoke his first word to her. It was not his name. He did not seem to know his name, or if he did, some deep animal part of him refused to give it away, as though a name were the last thing he owned, and letting it go would mean losing himself entirely. "Cold," he said one January evening when Elena arrived soaked from the walk over and shivering despite her coat. It wasn't much, but it was a door cracking open. She started calling him Nico because he'd once pointed, wordless, at a picture of a fox in his lighthouse book, and fox, in the old dialect her grandmother used to speak, was something close to it, and it felt gentler than calling a traumatized 4-year-old the boy in room 6. He didn't correct her. He didn't confirm it either. But the next time she said, "Nico, do you want to hear the story again?" he climbed into her lap without being asked, and that, she decided, was answer enough. The adoption process was its own kind of war. Elena was single, 25 by the time she filed the paperwork, a nurse with a modest income and no family support beyond 3 brothers who thought she was insane. The caseworkers warned her that a boy with Nico's documented trauma history, the unexplained arrival, the refusal to discuss his past, the night terrors that made him wake screaming words in what sounded, disturbingly, like fragments of Italian threats overheard from men he could not consciously remember, would likely need more resources than a single working mother could provide. "Then I'll find the resources," Elena told the family court judge, a stern woman named Alvarez who had seen 1,000 petitioners plead their case and had grown professionally immune to tears. "I'm not asking you to believe I can give him everything. I'm asking you to believe I won't stop trying." Something in that answer must have landed, because 18 months after she first sat on that cold linoleum floor with a wooden train and a chocolate bar, Elena Marchetti became, legally and permanently, the mother of a boy named Nico Marchetti. She quit her overnight shifts at the hospital and picked up steadier day work at a pediatric clinic in Astoria, trading better pay for a schedule that let her be home by 5. She moved them into a slightly bigger apartment, 2 blocks from a public school with a decent reputation. She learned, through trial and devastating error, how to handle the night terrors, how to sit at the foot of his bed without touching him until the thrashing stopped, how to say his name, his new name, over and over, like an anchor line thrown into dark water. "Nico, you're safe. Nico, I'm here. Nico, it's me. It's Elena. You're safe." She never told him he was adopted, exactly, because that would have implied she had ever thought of him as anything other than entirely, completely hers. But she told him the truth in the plain way children can absorb it. "I didn't grow you in my belly," she said, when he was 6 and asked why he didn't look like her. "But I chose you. Some kids get grown. You got chosen. I think chosen might even be better, because I picked you on purpose." He seemed to accept this the way children accept most impossible things, completely, and then he went back to building his Lego tower. What Elena did not know, could not have known, was that men were still, occasionally, quietly looking. Damiano Vitale's search had gone cold on the surface, but never truly stopped. Every year, a private investigator on retainer combed foster and adoption records for boys of the right age with the right physical markers, cross-referencing DNA against a sample Damiano kept sealed in a safety deposit box from the day his son was born. But New York's child welfare system was a labyrinth designed deliberately to protect vulnerable children from exactly the kind of powerful, dangerous men who might come looking for them. And Nico Marchetti's sealed adoption records were buried under privacy laws thick enough to stop even Damiano Vitale's money. For years, the trail simply ended at St. Agnes, at a boy who had been moved out before the investigators thought to look there, adopted under a name that matched no missing persons report because, as far as the world knew, Enzo Vitale had died somewhere in the East River drainage system 13 years ago, and the case had been marked in more than one detective's private notes, presumed deceased. Elena raised her son through elementary school plays and skinned knees, through a bout of pneumonia in second grade that terrified her so badly she slept in a chair by his hospital bed for 4 nights straight, through the ordinary miracles and disasters of childhood. She dated occasionally, a firefighter named Marco for 8 months, a fellow nurse's brother for a few dinners that fizzled into nothing, but she never let anyone close enough to threaten the fragile architecture she'd built around her son's safety. Men who wanted a family that came pre-assembled, with all its scars already visible, were rarer than she'd hoped, and she stopped, eventually, looking very hard. By the time Nico turned 17, Elena Marchetti was 38 years old, tired in the specific way of women who have spent 2 decades putting someone else first. And she thought, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has done a hard job well, that the worst of it was behind her. She had no idea that the worst of it, and the best of it, was about to begin. It happened on a Tuesday in October, the kind of ordinary Tuesday that later feels obscene in its ordinariness, given what it set into motion. Nico Marchetti, 17 years old, 6 feet tall, with his mother's, Elena's, habit of narrating jokes badly, and his birth father's exact jawline, though neither of them knew that yet, was riding his bike home from soccer practice when a black SUV ran a red light on Ditmars Boulevard and clipped his rear wheel hard enough to send him into the side of a parked delivery truck. Elena got the call at the clinic at 5:47 p.m. Her hands shook so badly she couldn't get her car keys into the ignition and had to ask a co-worker to drive her to the hospital. He was alive. Broken collarbone, a mild concussion, road rash down one arm that would scar in interesting patterns for the rest of his life, but alive, conscious, cracking a weak joke about how at least he'd get out of the geometry test on Thursday. Elena cried so hard in the emergency room hallway that a passing resident asked if she needed a sedative. She refused. She sat by his bed all night, the way she had a decade earlier during the pneumonia, holding his hand while he slept, and did not for a moment think about the black SUV, or the driver who had left the scene before police arrived, or the small dark detail that the responding officer mentioned almost as an afterthought while filling out the incident report. That a witness across the street had said the SUV didn't look like it was fleeing an accident so much as repositioning, circling the block twice before the collision, as if it had been waiting for the boy specifically. Elena filed that comment away as police overcaution and forgot about it within a week, because the alternative, that someone had deliberately targeted her son, was not a thought her mind had any framework to hold. Across the city, in a penthouse office on the 40th floor of a building he owned outright, Damiano Vitale was not thinking about ordinary Tuesdays at all. He was thinking about a DNA lab report that had landed on his desk 4 days earlier, forwarded by the private investigator he'd kept on retainer for 13 years, a man named Aldo Ferreira, who had by that point run down and eliminated over 200 false leads, with the grim patience of a man being paid extraordinarily well to never give up. The 201st lead had come from an unlikely source, a hospital records clerk, bribed years ago and forgotten, who had finally flagged a partial match buried in an old pediatric trauma admission from that very night. A 17-year-old boy named Nico Marchetti, admitted after a bicycle accident, whose blood type and a handful of incidental genetic markers pulled during routine trauma blood work lined up statistically in a way that made Aldo Ferreira's hands shake as he dialed his employer's private line. "It's not confirmed," Ferreira said, when Damiano answered on the first ring, the way he always did on the anniversary of the search, and every day since, out of a habit that had calcified into superstition. "I want to be careful with you here, Damiano. Partial markers aren't proof, but the age is right, the general region is right, and there's something else. Say it. The adoptive mother. Her name is Elena Marchetti. She's a pediatric nurse, single, no husband, no other kids. Records show she volunteered at St. Agnes Children's Home in Queens, starting the winter your son disappeared, and adopted a non-verbal boy of matching approximate age out of that same facility about 18 months later. The boy had no name on intake, no records prior to the placement that brought him there. It's like he came from nowhere." Damiano did not speak for a long moment. Ferreira, who had worked for him for over a decade and had learned to read the particular quality of his employer's silences, waited. "Get me a sample," Damiano said finally, his voice perfectly level, betraying nothing of the way his hand had closed, white-knuckled, around the edge of his desk. "Discreetly, whatever it takes. I want a full match confirmed within the week." "And if it's him?" Damiano looked for a long moment at the drawer in his desk where a stuffed wolf, worn soft with 13 years of unopened grief, still waited. "Then I want to know everything about the woman who kept him alive," he said, "before I do anything else. I want to know exactly what she is to him and exactly what I owe her, because a debt like that—" His voice caught, just slightly, the only crack any living person had heard in Damiano Vitale's composure in over a decade. "A debt like that doesn't get paid off. It gets honored." Ferreira, not a sentimental man by nature, found that he had to clear his throat before he could answer. "I'll have something for you by Thursday." He was wrong. He had something by Wednesday night, a sample lifted with the quiet efficiency of men accustomed to acquiring things without permission from a discarded coffee cup Nico had left on a hospital tray table, retrieved by a nurse's aide who had no idea what she was really being paid $200 in cash to fetch. The lab worked through the night. By 6 a.m. Thursday, Aldo Ferreira stood outside Damiano Vitale's penthouse with a sealed envelope in his hand and the particular dread of a man about to change another man's entire life with a single sheet of paper. Damiano opened the door himself. He did not say hello. He held out his hand. Ferreira gave him the envelope. Damiano Vitale, the Winter King, the man of ice, the man who had buried 3 killers with his own hands and never once let his men see him grieve, opened that envelope, standing in his doorway, in his shirt sleeves, at 6 in the morning, read 4 lines of laboratory text confirming a 99.98% probability of paternity, and sat down, hard, on the marble floor of his own foyer, because his legs simply stopped working. 13 years. His son was alive. His son was 17 years old and had a broken collarbone and had been raised by a stranger's love in an apartment 2 boroughs away, and did not know his own name, and did not know his father existed, and did not know that a war he'd never heard of had shaped every year of his life, from the moment a wet curtain blew through an open nursery window.
Damiano.
Ferreira crouched down, genuinely alarmed. Damiano, are you? Get me everything on Elena Marchetti, Damiano said, and his voice, when it came, did not sound like ice at all. It sounded like a man surfacing from very deep water, gasping for the first real breath he'd taken in over a decade. Everything. Today. And Aldo. He looked up, and for the first time in 13 years, something moved behind his eyes that was not simply calculation. Whatever it costs, whatever she needs, whatever I have to become, I am not losing him again. Elena noticed him first because he was too still. The pediatric orthopedic follow-up clinic, where Nico's collarbone was being checked, was not, generally, a place that attracted men who looked like the one sitting in the far corner of the waiting room on Friday morning. A man in a charcoal suit that fit with the precision of something tailored rather than bought. Reading a folded newspaper he did not appear to actually be reading. Glancing up every few seconds toward the check-in desk with an intensity that made the receptionist visibly nervous. He was, Elena guessed, somewhere in his mid-30s. Dark hair, silver already threading at the temples, in a way that looked less like age and more like weather damage. A face built from hard, symmetrical planes, the kind of face that would have been simply, uncomplicatedly handsome if it weren't for the eyes. Eyes that held a coldness so absolute it made the room feel a few degrees colder just from being in his line of sight. Nico, oblivious, was scrolling through his phone beside her, one arm still in a sling, complaining about missing the away game against Bayside. "Mum, seriously, Coach Delgado said if I'm cleared by next week, I can at least sit on the bench. And if I can't even do that, I'm just gonna—" "You're not doing anything until Dr. Osei clears you," Elena said, not looking up from the intake form. "I don't care what Coach Delgado says. Coach Delgado didn't sit up with you the night you were admitted. You always bring that up. I'll bring it up until you're 40. Nico rolled his eyes with the specific, affectionate exasperation of a teenager who has long since given up expecting his mother to be anything other than relentlessly protective, and went back to his phone. Neither of them noticed that the man in the corner had gone perfectly, unnaturally still at the sound of the boy's voice, as if hearing it confirmed something the DNA report alone hadn't quite made real. Damiano Vitale had told himself he would only observe. Ferreira's dossier on Elena Marchetti had taken 4 days to compile, and had left Damiano sitting in his study until 3 in the morning, reading and rereading details of a life he had never imagined for the woman who had, without knowing it, raised his son. She had cut her own salary in half to afford Nico's asthma medication in the years before he outgrew it. She had worked double shifts through 2 consecutive Christmases so she could afford a decent computer for his schoolwork. She had, according to a neighbour Ferreira had discreetly interviewed under the pretense of an insurance survey, gone 11 months without buying a single new piece of clothing for herself the year Nico needed braces. She had never married. She had, as far as Ferreira could determine, systematically declined every opportunity for a serious relationship that might have complicated her single-minded devotion to a child that was not, biologically, hers to devote herself to at all. Damiano had read that last detail 3 times, something twisting hard and unfamiliar in his chest, and had not been able to name the feeling until he was standing in his shower an hour later, water running cold over his shoulders, and realized it was shame. A specific, corrosive shame that a woman with nothing had given his son everything, while he, with every resource in the world at his disposal, had failed to find him for 13 years. He had promised himself, sitting in that waiting room, that he would simply watch, confirm what he already knew from the lab report, see his son's face whole and alive with his own eyes. Leave. Plan a proper approach through lawyers, through Ferreira, through some careful mechanism that wouldn't terrify a woman who had spent 17 years protecting a boy from exactly the kind of danger Damiano's world represented. But then Nico laughed at something on his phone, an easy, unguarded laugh, his head tipping back slightly, and Damiano saw, with a jolt that nearly stopped his heart, his own mother's smile on his son's face, and every careful plan he'd made evaporated. He stood up. Elena noticed the movement immediately, some old nurse's instinct for reading a room, some newer instinct honed over 17 years of vigilance for reading threat. The man in the charcoal suit was walking toward them, and though his stride was unhurried, there was something in the set of his shoulders that made her pulse spike before her conscious mind had caught up. "Nico," she said quietly, "put your phone away." "What? Why?" The man stopped a few feet away. Up close, Elena could see that his eyes were not, in fact, entirely cold. There was something raw underneath the ice, something that looked almost like grief or hunger, or both at once, and it disturbed her far more than simple menace would have. "Mrs. Marchetti," he said. His voice was low, cultured, faintly accented in a way that suggested money and old-world upbringing rather than anything specifically threatening. "My name is Damiano Vitale. I wonder if I might have a moment of your time." "It's Miss Marchetti," Elena said automatically, standing, positioning herself half a step in front of Nico, without entirely deciding to do it. "And I don't know you, Mr. Vitale, and this is a private medical appointment, so if you'll—" "I know this is going to sound insane," Damiano said, and something in his composure cracked, just slightly, just enough for Elena to see the man underneath the ice. "And I would give anything not to do this to you here, in a waiting room like this. I wanted to find a gentler way. I've been trying for 4 days to find a gentler way, and I couldn't, because there isn't one. There's no version of this conversation that doesn't turn your life upside down, and I'm sorry for that more than you will ever know." "Mr.
Vitale, I need you to step back or I'm calling security."
"His name," Damiano said, and his voice broke on the words in a way that made Nico finally look up from his phone, alarmed. "His birth name is Enzo. Enzo Vitale. He is my son. He was taken from his nursery when he was 3 years old, and I have been looking for him for 13 years, and I am not here to take him from you, Ms. Marchetti. God, I would never. I am here because a laboratory confirmed 4 days ago that the boy sitting beside you is the child I lost, and I could not, in good conscience, let one more day pass without you knowing the truth." The waiting room had gone completely silent. Even the receptionist had stopped typing. Elena Marchetti felt the floor tilt beneath her feet, and for one long, suspended moment, the only sound in the entire world was her own heartbeat, hammering out a single word over and over. "No, no, no, No. Nico stood up so fast his sling caught on the arm of the chair. What the hell is he talking about? His voice cracked on the last word. 17 years old, and suddenly a small child again, looking between Elena's ashen face and the stranger's raw, unguarded one. Mum? Mum, what is he talking about? Elena couldn't answer. Her mouth had gone completely dry. Every instinct she owned, every fierce, protective instinct that had kept this boy safe for 17 years, was screaming at her to grab Nico's hand and run. And simultaneously, underneath that scream, a colder, more clinical part of her brain, the part trained by a decade in medicine to evaluate evidence rather than panic, was already doing something far more dangerous. It was looking at Damiano Vitale's face, at the particular architecture of his jaw and the shape of his eyes, and finding, with sick, plummeting certainty, an answer she did not want to see. "I don't believe you," she said, but her voice had no conviction in it at all. "I have the lab results in my car," Damiano said quietly. "I have 13 years of missing persons reports, filed with the NYPD, filed with the FBI, that you can verify with a single phone call. I am not asking you to take my word for anything, Ms. Marchetti. I am asking for the chance to prove it to you somewhere private, somewhere safe, where we are not standing in a hospital waiting room, terrifying a boy who has done nothing to deserve any of this." "Terrifying me?" Nico's voice cracked again, higher this time, panic bleeding through the bravado. "Mum, I don't... Is he serious? Is this... Mum, please tell me this guy's insane." Elena looked at her son, at Nico, at the boy she had raised from a silent, traumatized 4-year-old into a laughing, complicated, entirely wonderful 17-year-old, and felt something in her chest tear cleanly in half. Because underneath the panic in his voice, underneath her own instinct to protect him from a stranger's outrageous claim, there was a memory surfacing that she had buried so deep, for so long, that she'd almost convinced herself it wasn't real. The night terrors. The fragments of Italian he used to scream in his sleep as a small child. Words she'd never understood and eventually stopped trying to translate because the process upset him too much. The complete absence of any documented history before St. Agnes. The way, occasionally, in unguarded moments, Nico's face would settle into an expression of such adult severity that it looked wrong on a child. Like a mask borrowed from someone much older, much colder, much more dangerous than a 7-year-old boy should ever have access to. She had spent 17 years deliberately not asking the question that Damiano Vitale had just walked into a hospital waiting room and answered without being asked. "Security," she said, finally, weakly, to no one in particular. "I need to call Miss Marchetti." Damiano's voice softened, and something in it, some naked, desperate honesty, cut through her panic more effectively than any threat could have. "I am not here to hurt you. I am not here to hurt him. I have spent 13 years and more money than either of us can meaningfully imagine trying to find my son. And every single lead went nowhere, and I had genuinely begun to believe he was dead. If it turns out I'm wrong, if this DNA match is somehow an error, and I pray to God it isn't, because I cannot bear the thought of losing him twice, then I will walk out of this waiting room, and you will never see me again, and I will apologize for the rest of my life for putting you and this boy through even a moment of this. But if I'm right..." His voice caught again, and Elena watched, astonished despite herself, as tears rose in the eyes of a man who, by every visible marker of his bearing and dress, looked like someone who did not permit himself to weep in public, ever, for any reason. If I'm right, then everything you've done for him, every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every dollar you didn't spend on yourself so he could have what he needed, I owe you a debt I could never repay if I spent every remaining year of my life trying. Nico had gone very quiet, staring at Damiano with an expression Elena had never seen on her son's face before. A strange, dawning recognition, as though some deep, wordless part of him was reaching backward through 17 years of silence toward a memory his conscious mind had never been allowed to keep. "I don't remember you," Nico said slowly. "I don't remember anything before." He stopped. His hand had drifted unconsciously to his own jaw, tracing it the way you'd trace a familiar shape in the dark. "I don't remember anything at all before St. Agnes. Mom always said, 'I know,'" Damiano said gently. "I know. And that's not your fault, and it will never be your fault. You were 3 years old. Trauma does that. It buries things so deep, sometimes they never come back at all, and other times they come back at the worst, strangest moments, when you're not looking for them." Dr. Osei chose that exact, agonizing moment to open the exam room door and call, cheerfully oblivious, "Nico Marchetti!" The three of them stood, frozen, in a waiting room full of strangers, on the edge of a truth that would unmake and remake all of their lives, and for one long, suspended second, nobody moved at all. Then Elena, drawing on some reserve of steel she hadn't known she still possessed after 17 years of single-handedly holding a family together, turned to Dr. Osei and said, in a voice only slightly less steady than usual, "We're going to need to reschedule." She turned back to Damiano Vitale. "You'll bring your lab results," she said, "and your missing persons report, and whatever else you have, to a public place, not your home, not mine, somewhere with cameras and other people. And you will let me have those results independently verified before I say one more word to my son about any of this. Do you understand me, Mr. Vitale? I don't care how much money you have or how many DNA labs you can afford to buy. I have spent 17 years protecting this boy. And I am not going to stop now, no matter whose blood is in his veins." Something shifted in Damiano's expression. Not offence, but something closer to profound, aching respect.
"Yes," he said quietly. "Of course. Whatever you need. I'll bring everything, and I'll wait as long as it takes. And, Ms. Marchetti—" He looked at her then, with an intensity that made her breath catch despite the impossible chaos of the moment, an intensity that had nothing to do with paternity tests, and everything, though neither of them could have named it yet, to do with the way a starving man looks at the first kindness he's been offered in a very long time. "Thank you. For 17 years of thank yous I never got to give you. Thank you." The independent lab confirmed it 4 days later, on a Tuesday that felt to Elena like the ground had been quietly, permanently pulled out from beneath her entire life. She had insisted on a hospital lab she trusted personally, run by a former colleague named Dr. Priya Anand, who owed Elena a favour from a difficult shift years ago, and who processed the samples herself, off the books, with a level of discretion that cost Damiano
though Elena refused to let him pay for it directly, a small fortune in expedited private testing fees. The results were unambiguous. Nico Marchetti was, biologically, Enzo Damiano Vitale, born 17 years ago at Lenox Hill Hospital to Damiano Vitale and a woman named Sofia Rienzi, who, Elena learned this detail from Ferreira's carefully assembled dossier with a fresh wave of grief on Nico's behalf, had died of complications during childbirth, meaning that in one terrible night, 13 years later, Nico had lost the only other parent he'd ever had, and had never even gotten the chance to know her. They met, the three of them, in a private room at a restaurant Damiano owned outright on the Upper East Side, public enough with staff and cameras that Elena's safety conditions were technically met, but private enough that no stranger would overhear whatever was about to unfold. Nico had barely spoken in the 4 days since the waiting room. Elena had watched him retreat into a kind of shocked, careful silence she recognized with a nurse's clinical dread. The same silence he'd worn as a 4-year-old, the same silence that had taken 8 months of patient, gentle presence to crack open the first time. She was terrified of losing him to that silence again. She was more terrified, though she would not have admitted this even to herself, of the strange, unwelcome pull she felt toward the man responsible for shattering her careful, hard-won peace. The way Damiano Vitale's raw grief in that waiting room had cracked something open in her that she'd kept sealed for 17 years, a longing for a partner, an equal, someone who might carry a portion of the weight she'd carried alone for so long. "I brought photographs," Damiano said, once they were seated, sliding a leather folio across the table with hands that, Elena noticed, were not entirely steady. "Of you as a baby, of your mother, your birth mother, Sofia, of the nursery. I want you to look at them only if you want to. There is no obligation here, Enzo. Nico. I'm sorry. I don't know what to call you." "Nico," Nico said immediately, sharply, the first real emotion he'd shown in days. "My name is Nico. Nico Marchetti. Whatever else is true, that's my name." "Okay," Damiano said, and something in his face, some flicker of pain, quickly and deliberately suppressed, told Elena that this had cost him something significant to accept, gracefully, in the moment. "Nico, that's your name. I'll only ever call you that if that's what you want." Nico opened the folio with visibly shaking hands. The photographs inside told a story more effectively than any of Damiano's words had managed. A newborn, wrapped in a blue blanket, held by a woman with Nico's exact honey-coloured eyes, her face lit with the exhausted, radiant joy of new motherhood. A toddler in a garden, laughing, reaching up toward a man who could only be a much younger Damiano, his face open and unguarded in a way it clearly hadn't been in years. A third birthday party, with a small cake shaped like a fire truck, 3 candles, a room full of relatives whose faces meant nothing to Nico now, but whose eyes, whose noses, whose particular way of smiling echoed unmistakably in his own reflection. "That's—" Nico's voice cracked. His finger hovered over the photograph of his birth mother without quite touching it, as if she might disappear if he pressed too hard. "Is that her? Is that—" "Sofia," Damiano said quietly. "Your mother. She loved you so much, Nico, from the very first moment. I wish—" His composure broke, fully, for the first time since Elena had met him, and he had to look away from the table for a long moment before continuing.
I wish every day that she'd lived to see you grow up. I wish she could see you now. She would be so proud of the man you're becoming. I can already see it in the little time I've had to look at you.
Elena watched her son's face crumple, watched 17 years of careful, hard-won emotional stability fracture under the weight of a grief he'd never known he was entitled to carry. And every protective instinct in her body screamed at her to reach across the table and pull him into her arms. She did it anyway. Debt or blood or biology be damned, he was still, would always be, in every way that mattered, her son.
It's okay,
she murmured into his hair, the way she had 1,000 times before, through night terrors and skinned knees and every crisis life had thrown at them.
I'm right here. I've got you. Whatever this is, whatever it means, I'm not going anywhere.
Over the top of Nico's shaking shoulders, she caught Damiano Vitale watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Something between gratitude so profound it looked almost like pain, and something else entirely, something warmer and far more dangerous that made her pulse stumble despite the chaos of the moment.
I meant what I said in the waiting room, Damiano said quietly, once Nico had steadied enough to sit back, wiping his face with the back of his uninjured hand, embarrassed by his own tears in the way teenage boys often are. I am not here to take him from you, Miss Marchetti. I don't have that right, and even if I did, I would never exercise it. You are his mother. That is not a biological fact, and it's not up for negotiation. But I am asking, and I understand if this is too much too soon, whether there's room in his life, in both your lives, for me to be a part of it, whatever that looks like, slowly, on your terms, both of your terms. Elena studied his face for a long moment, the raw hope in it, carefully leashed, the desperate restraint of a man who had clearly learned over 13 agonizing years not to expect the things he wanted most. That's going to have to be up to Nico, she said finally, not me. I've made every decision for him his whole life because he needed someone to. But he's 17. He gets a say in this one. Nico looked between them. Between the mother who had raised him from nothing, and the father whose blood ran in his veins and whose eyes stared back at him from a stranger's decades-old photograph, and said, in a small, uncertain voice that broke both adults' hearts in entirely different ways, I don't know who I am anymore. You're Nico, Elena said fiercely, immediately. You've always been Nico. That part never changes, no matter what else we figure out. And across the table, Damiano Vitale, a man who had built an empire on cold calculation and controlled violence, found himself blinking back tears for the second time in a week, undone entirely by the sight of a mother's fierce, unconditional love for a son that biology had tried and failed to make into anything less than fully, completely hers. What none of them discussed that evening, what Damiano deliberately withheld, weighing his son's fragile emotional state against a truth too dangerous to introduce yet, was that Nico's reappearance had not gone unnoticed. The Calabrese family had spent 13 years believing Enzo Vitale was dead. It was, in fact, a foundational assumption of the current fragile peace between the two organizations. A peace built on the understanding that Damiano Vitale had no heir,
no succession plan beyond his own uncertain mortality, which made him, in the calculating minds of rival bosses, a man worth negotiating with rather than eliminating. Because his death would fracture the Vitale organization into exploitable pieces rather than consolidating cleanly under a designated successor. A living son changed that calculation entirely. Salvatore Calabrese, the head of the rival family and the man who had 13 years earlier quietly ordered the kidnapping through an intermediary inside Damiano's own organization, a plot that had gone catastrophically sideways when the ransom handoff was botched, forcing his men to abandon a screaming 3-year-old in a queen's stairwell rather than risk capture, had spent over a decade believing the loose thread of his greatest crime had simply, conveniently, tied itself off. A dead child left no evidence, no witnesses, no future claimant to a fortune Salvatore had spent 13 years slowly, patiently maneuvering to inherit through less direct means. A living son with a confirmed DNA match was not a loose thread. It was a bomb. Salvatore learned about Nico Marchetti's existence within 11 days of Damiano's waiting room revelation, from a source inside the private lab that had run the independent verification test. A lab technician with gambling debts who had been quietly, permanently on the Calabrese payroll for exactly this kind of intelligence, though he'd never before had information of this magnitude to sell. "He's alive," Salvatore said, more to himself than to the two capos standing in his study, turning the information over like a man testing the edge of a blade. 13 years, and he's alive, and Damiano's already found him. "You want us to handle it?" one of the capos asked, using the particular flat euphemism that meant exactly what it sounded like it meant. Salvatore was quiet for a long moment, considering the bicycle accident, his own earlier, cruder attempt to eliminate the loose thread, before confirming its true significance, ordered the moment his lab source flagged the initial partial DNA match, before the full confirmation came through, had failed, clumsily, and had likely put Damiano's security apparatus on alert in ways that would make a second, similarly crude attempt significantly more dangerous. "No," he said finally, "not yet, not directly. Damiano will have the boy wrapped in more security than the Federal Reserve within the week, if he hasn't already. We move carefully, we watch, we wait for the moment they're vulnerable, and Damiano's always vulnerable when it comes to that boy. He always has been. That's the whole reason this worked the first time." What Salvatore did not yet know, what would become in the weeks ahead the single most dangerous vulnerability in the entire situation, was that Damiano Vitale's growing, ferocious protectiveness was not limited to his newly recovered son. It extended, with increasing and unignorable intensity, to the woman who had raised him. Damiano had told himself, in the days following that devastating dinner, that his fixation on Elena Marchetti was purely gratitude, a debt of honor, nothing more. He arranged, without her knowledge at first, for private security to quietly monitor the block around her apartment building, reasoning that Nico's safety necessarily included hers, since they refused, both of them, to be separated, even for the sake of increased protection. He had his lawyers draft, though he did not yet send them, documents establishing a trust in Elena's name, substantial enough that she would never again have to work a double shift to afford anything her son, or she herself, might need. But gratitude did not explain the way he found himself thinking about her voice. Steady, fierce, unshakable, even in the worst moment of her life, at inconvenient hours of the night. Gratitude did not explain the way he'd begun, almost involuntarily, comparing every other woman he'd ever known against the specific, unglamorous heroism of a nurse who had given up 17 years of her own life without once asking for recognition or reward. He mentioned none of this to anyone. Certainly not to Ferreira, who would have raised an eyebrow in a way that Damiano, even as the undisputed head of one of America's most powerful crime families, found he did not have the composure to withstand. Certainly not to Elena herself, who had made abundantly, admirably clear that her only priority was Nico's well-being, and who regarded Damiano still with the wary, watchful distance of a woman who had spent 17 years learning not to trust powerful men with anything she couldn't afford to lose. The three of them, Damiano, Elena and Nico, settled over the following 2 weeks into an uneasy, careful rhythm. Dinners twice a week, always in public, always with Elena present as a fixed, unmovable point in the negotiation of Nico's relationship with his birth father. Damiano learned, slowly, painfully, the shape of the son he'd lost. His love of engineering, inherited, Damiano suspected with quiet wonder, from a grandfather Nico had never met. His stubborn, prickly independence, which Damiano privately, silently, attributed to 17 years of Elena's fierce example. His complicated, still unresolved grief over a mother he'd only just learned he had lost twice, once at birth, and once again in every year he hadn't gotten to know her. Elena, for her part, watched Damiano Vitale with a caution that was slowly, despite her every effort to prevent it, beginning to soften into something more complicated. She watched him ask Nico's permission before every small gesture of affection, watched him absorb Nico's occasional flares of teenage anger and confusion without a trace of the ruthlessness she'd have expected from a man of his reputation. Watched him, on one memorable evening, quietly excuse himself to the restaurant's private restroom after Nico made an offhand joke about his birth mother's smile, and return 11 minutes later with red-rimmed eyes and a composure rebuilt, brick by careful brick, purely for his son's benefit. She did not yet know about Salvatore Calabrese, or the bicycle accident that had nearly killed her son as a calculated act of political violence rather than random chance. She did not know that the growing web of quiet, unobtrusive security around her apartment building, the black car that seemed to idle a half-block away more nights than not, the doorman who'd suddenly, inexplicably received a substantial raise and a new set of very specific instructions, was Damiano's doing, born of a fear he could not yet bring himself to voice. She only knew that the cold, dangerous man from the waiting room was in increasingly undeniable ways not cold at all, and that the careful architecture of her own guarded heart, built brick by careful brick over 17 years of solitary devotion, was beginning, in small and terrifying ways, to crack. The invitation came on a Friday, delivered not by Damiano himself, but by a formally worded note on heavy cream cardstock, handed to Elena by Ferreira outside the clinic where she worked, with an old-world courtesy that felt to her both charming and faintly ridiculous. Miss Marchetti, I would be honoured if you would join Nico and me for dinner at my home this Sunday. I understand if you would prefer to keep our meetings in public spaces, and I will respect that entirely if you say so. But Nico has expressed interest in seeing where I live, and I did not want to bring him there without your explicit knowledge and consent. D.V. Asterisk. She said yes in the end, mostly because Nico had already, separately, texted her 3 increasingly excited messages about the penthouse, which apparently occupied the top 4 floors of a building overlooking Central Park, and included, according to Nico's breathless reporting, its own indoor basketball court. The penthouse, when Elena finally saw it that Sunday evening, was everything she'd expected from a man of Damiano Vitale's reputed wealth, and nothing at all like what she'd expected from the man himself. She had imagined ostentation, gold fixtures, oversized portraits, the aggressive, joyless luxury of new money trying too hard. Instead, she found warm wood floors, walls lined floor to ceiling with books in 3 languages, and in the corner of the vast living room, a single glass display case containing, incongruously, a small, worn, stuffed wolf. She noticed Nico notice it too, saw him drift toward the case, drawn by some instinct he couldn't name, and watched his face go pale and strange as he stared at the small stuffed animal inside. "That's mine," he said slowly, wonderingly, his hand pressing flat against the glass. I don't remember it exactly, but I know it's mine. How do I know that?" Damiano, standing a careful distance away, his hands clasped behind his back in the posture of a man forcibly restraining every instinct he had toward physical comfort, answered with visible effort to keep his voice steady. "You slept with it every night from the day you were born until the night you disappeared," he said. "It was on the windowsill of your nursery when—" He stopped, started again. "When they took you. I kept it in that case because I couldn't bear to put it away in a drawer, and I couldn't bear to look at it every day either. That was the compromise I made with myself. Some part of me, I think, always knew I'd need it back in reach someday." Nico's hand trembled against the glass. Elena watched her son's face crumple with the particular grief of recovering a memory too old, too pre-verbal to fully access, only its emotional weight surviving intact, and crossed the room without thinking to stand beside him, her hand finding his shoulder in the same steady, grounding gesture she'd used 1,000 times through 17 years of night terrors and heartbreaks. "Can I open the case?" Nico asked, his voice small. "It's yours," Damiano said. "It was always yours. You never have to ask my permission for anything that was already yours before I lost you." Nico opened the case with hands that shook badly enough that Elena reached over to steady them and lifted the small stuffed wolf out with the careful reverence of a man handling something sacred. He held it for a long moment, saying nothing, his face working through some private storm of emotion too complicated for words, and then, without warning, he began, quietly, to cry. Not the sharp, startled tears of the restaurant dinner, but something deeper, older, a grief that seemed to be reaching all the way back to a 3-year-old boy screaming in a stranger's arms in the rain, finally, after 14 years, given somewhere to land. Elena pulled him into her arms without hesitation, the way she had 1,000 times before, murmuring the same steady reassurances she'd offered through every crisis of his childhood. Over his shoulder she caught Damiano's face, and what she saw there stopped her breath entirely. A naked, unguarded longing, so profound it looked almost like physical pain. The longing of a father who wanted, more than anything in the world, to be the one holding his son in this moment, and who was instead standing 3 feet away, with his hands clenched at his sides, forcing himself, with visible, agonizing effort, to let Elena be the comfort Nico needed, because he understood, with a clarity that broke Elena's heart to witness, that he had not yet earned the right to that comfort himself. "You can come closer," Elena said quietly over Nico's shoulder, surprising herself with the offer. "He's your son too. He's allowed more than one person holding him up." Something in Damiano's carefully controlled composure finally, fully broke. He crossed the room in 3 strides and folded both of them, his son and the woman who had raised him, into an embrace so careful, so tentative, so entirely unlike the confident stride of a man who ruled an empire, that Eleanor felt something in her own chest crack open in response. Some final wall she'd built 17 years ago, finally, quietly, giving way. They stood like that for a long time, the 3 of them, in a penthouse that had been, for 13 years, a monument to grief, while a small, stuffed wolf, worn soft with love from 2 different lifetimes, was held between them like a promise. Later that night, after Nico had fallen asleep in one of the penthouse's guest rooms, an arrangement Eleanor had agreed to only after satisfying herself, through a series of increasingly specific and pointed questions, that the building's security was genuinely as extensive as Damiano claimed. Elena found herself alone with him on the terrace, looking out over a central park lit gold and orange by the last of the sunset. "Thank you," Damiano said quietly, "for what you did in there, letting me closer. You didn't have to do that." "He needed it," Elena said. "That's the only reason I do anything anymore. What he needs." "And what do you need, Elena?" The use of her first name, unadorned by formal titles, for the first time since they'd met, landed on her skin like a physical touch. She turned to look at him and found him watching her with an intensity that made the cold October air feel suddenly dangerously warm. "I don't know anymore," she admitted, more honestly than she'd intended. "I stopped asking myself that question a long time ago. It seemed easier." "That sounds like a very lonely way to live," Damiano said softly. "It was," Elena said, "but it kept him safe. That was always the only thing that mattered." Damiano stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him despite the chill in the air, close enough that some old, careful part of her screamed a warning she found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, disinclined to heed. "I would like," he said carefully, "to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to be lonely again, if you'll let me. I understand it's too soon to say that. I understand you have every reason not to trust a man like me. But I've spent 13 years mourning a life I thought I'd never get back, and I am not interested in wasting one more day pretending I don't feel what I feel, simply because the timing is inconvenient." Elena's heart was hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Mr. Vitale—" "Damiano," he corrected gently. "Damiano," she said, and the name felt strange and dangerous in her mouth. "I raised your son. That's not nothing. That comes with complications neither of us fully understand yet. And you're—" She gestured helplessly at the penthouse, the view, the entire glittering, dangerous world he inhabited. "You're this. And I'm a nurse who works double shifts and clips coupons and hasn't been on a real date in 6 years. I don't know what you think you see in me, but I promise you, whatever it is, It's not going to survive contact with reality. Damiano's expression when he answered held no trace of doubt at all. "What I see," he said, "is a woman who gave up everything. Every comfort, every relationship, every year of her own life for a child that wasn't biologically hers, and never once asked for a single thing in return. I've spent 38 years surrounded by people who want something from me. You are the first person I have ever met who wanted nothing at all and gave everything anyway. I don't think you understand, Elena, how rare that is. I don't think you understand what that makes you in a world like mine." "What does it make me?" Elena asked, barely above a whisper. "Everything," Damiano said simply. "It makes you everything." He did not kiss her that night. He stepped back instead, with visible, deliberate restraint, and said only, "I'm not going anywhere, Elena. Whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here." But the space between them had changed irrevocably, and both of them knew it, standing on that terrace with a stuffed wolf sleeping safely inside, and a whole dangerous world waiting, unacknowledged, just beyond the glow of the city lights. The trouble started, as trouble often does, with a man named Chris Delacroix. Chris was a pediatric anesthesiologist at the clinic where Elena worked. 34, unmarried, disarmingly charming in the low-key way of men who don't need to try very hard because their charm has simply never failed them before. He had asked Elena to dinner 3 times over the past 2 years. 3 times she had gently declined, citing Nico, citing work, citing anything convenient that wasn't the real reason, which was that she had never had room in her life for anything beyond her son. Now, with Nico settling, however uneasily, into a relationship with his newly discovered father, Elena found herself for the first time in years with actual free evenings. And Chris, sensing the shift with the confident instinct of a man who'd been patiently waiting, asked a 4th time. She said yes. She did not mention this to Damiano, mostly because it did not occur to her that she owed him any explanation at all. They were not, officially, anything to each other beyond co-parents navigating an impossible situation. The terrace conversation had hung between them for 3 weeks, unresolved, neither of them willing to be the one to push it further. And Elena had told herself repeatedly that this ambiguity was for the best, that a relationship with Damiano Vitale would be, by any rational measure, an act of profound self-destruction. Damiano found out about the date the way he found out about most things concerning Elena Marchetti's life, through Ferreira's discreet, ongoing security detail, which had, admittedly, expanded slightly beyond the strict boundaries of monitoring for Calabrese threats into something closer to monitoring Elena Marchetti's entire existence, a mission creep Damiano had authorized without examining his own motives too closely. "She's having dinner Thursday night at Locanda Verde," Ferreira reported, with the careful neutrality of a man who knew exactly how dangerous this information was and had decided, professionally, not to have an opinion about it. "Reservations under a name I ran, Christopher Delacroix, anesthesiologist at her clinic. Clean record, no priors, no known associations, no debt, just a doctor." Damiano said nothing for a long moment, standing at the window of his office with his back to Ferreira, his jaw working with a tension that Ferreira, in over a decade of loyal service, had rarely seen directed at anything other than a genuine operational threat. Cancel security on the restaurant that night, Damiano said, finally. Sir, I'll handle it personally. Ferreira, who understood exactly what handle it personally meant when Damiano Vitale's voice carried that particular, flat, dangerous quality, chose the better part of valour and did not ask any further questions. Damiano told himself, driving to Locanda Verde on Thursday evening in a car he drove himself rather than summoning a driver, that he was simply exercising his security concerns, given the ongoing Calabrese threat, that any restaurant Elena chose needed to be vetted, regardless of the company she kept there. He told himself this right up until the moment he walked through the restaurant's front door, spotted Elena at a corner table, laughing, actually laughing, her whole face lit up in a way he realized, with a sharp, unwelcome jolt, he had never once managed to produce himself. At something the well-dressed man across from her had said, and felt a wave of pure, unreasoning fury so intense it frightened him. He did not approach the table. He was not, whatever his enemies believed of him, entirely without self-control. He sat instead at the restaurant's bar, ordered a whiskey he did not drink, and watched, with the grim, helpless fixation of a man observing his own emotional undoing in real time, as Elena Marchetti had, by every visible measure, an entirely pleasant evening with another man. She saw him around 9:30, when Chris excused himself briefly to the restroom, and she glanced up, out of some old habit of scanning a room, and found Damiano Vitale sitting at the bar, not 30 feet away, watching her with an expression that made her blood run cold and hot simultaneously. She excused herself from her own seat and crossed to him with the deliberate, controlled stride of a woman who had spent 17 years learning not to let anyone see her rattled. Are you following me? I was concerned about the venue's security, Damiano said, and even he could hear how thin the excuse sounded. Bullshit, Elena said, quietly enough not to carry, but with a flat, furious precision that surprised them both. You're jealous. I don't get jealous. Then what do you call this? Damiano was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight, his knuckles white around the untouched whiskey glass. I call it, he said finally, his voice low and rough with an honesty that seemed to cost him considerable effort. Watching a man I don't know make you laugh in a way I have never once managed to, and finding that I would very much like to put my fist through the wall of this restaurant. I call it realizing, for the first time in 13 years, that there is something in this world I want badly enough to frighten myself. I don't have a polite word for that, Elena. I only have the true one. Elena's breath caught. Behind her, she could hear Chris returning from the restroom, could hear the low murmur of the restaurant's other patrons, entirely oblivious to the quiet, dangerous storm building at the bar. You don't have the right, she said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier fury, to be jealous of a man I'm having dinner with. We're not... Damiano, we've never even... I know, Damiano said. I know I don't have the right. I'm telling you anyway because I promised myself 13 years ago in a nursery with an open window and rain coming through the curtains that if I ever got a second chance at happiness, I would not waste it being careful. I have been careful with everything else in my life. I am not interested in being careful about this. About what, exactly? About you, Damiano said simply. I am in love with you, Elena Marchetti, and I understand this is inconvenient and complicated and probably a very bad idea by every rational measure either of us could construct, and I am telling you anyway, because the alternative, Watching you build a life with someone else while I stand at bars pretending to drink whiskey I have no intention of finishing is not a future I am willing to accept without at least being honest with you first. Chris had reached the table by now, was looking across the restaurant with mild, confused concern at his date standing at the bar with a stranger. Elena looked back at him, then at Damiano, caught between two entirely different lives, two entirely different versions of a future she might build for herself. "I need to go finish my dinner," she said finally, her voice unsteady. "Of course," Damiano said, stepping back immediately, every trace of his earlier fury replaced with careful, painful restraint. "I apologize for the intrusion. I'll go." He left. Elena returned to her table, to Chris's polite, concerned questions about who that was, and found, to her own considerable dismay, that she could not, for the rest of the evening, stop thinking about the raw, unguarded honesty in Damiano Vitale's voice, or the way his confession had landed in her chest like something long overdue, finally, terrifyingly, arriving. She did not go on a second date with Chris Delacroix. She showed up at his penthouse 3 days later, unannounced, at 9 o'clock at night. Having spent those 3 days in a state of restless, unresolved agitation that she recognized with clinical dismay as something she hadn't felt since she was in her 20s. Nico was staying with a friend for a school project. She had no reason to be there beyond the reason she refused, for most of the drive over, to admit to herself. Damiano opened the door himself, in shirt sleeves, looking faintly surprised and immediately unmistakably pleased. "Elena, is everything—" "I need to say something," Elena said, before she could lose her nerve. "And I need you to let me say all of it without interrupting, because if you interrupt me, I am going to lose my courage and go home, and we're never going to speak about any of this again." Damiano wisely said nothing, and stepped back to let her inside. She paced the length of his living room twice before she found the words. "I have spent 17 years," she said finally, "making sure I never needed anyone. Not because I didn't want to, because I couldn't afford to. Every ounce of energy I had went into Nico, and there wasn't room for anything else. And eventually, I stopped believing there was supposed to be room for anything else. I told myself that was fine. I told myself that was even noble in some way. The self-sacrificing single mother, giving everything to her child, wanting nothing for herself. And it worked, mostly. Until 3 weeks ago, when a man who terrifies me for reasons that have nothing to do with his last name stood on a terrace and told me I was everything, and I have not been able to stop thinking about it since. "Elena, I told you not to interrupt." Damiano closed his mouth, though the corner of it twitched with something that was almost, despite the gravity of the moment, a smile. "I don't know how to do this," Elena continued, her voice unsteady now, some of her earlier composure finally cracking. "I don't know how to want something for myself, after 17 years of only wanting things for someone else. I don't know how to be with a man whose world involves whatever it involves, whatever you don't tell me, whatever Ferreira's black cars are actually doing outside my apartment building. Because I'm not stupid, Damiano. I've noticed. I don't know how to reconcile the man who held his son's stuffed wolf like it was the only thing keeping him alive with whatever you become when you're not standing in front of me. But I know that when you said those things at the restaurant, something in me that had been closed for 17 years cracked open, and I have not been able to close it again, no matter how hard I've tried. And I am so tired of trying." Damiano crossed the room slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back, to change her mind, to reconstruct whatever wall she needed. She did not step back. "I am not going to pretend to be a simple man," he said quietly, "because I'm not, and you're too smart to believe it if I tried. My world is dangerous, Elena. It has cost me people I loved before, and I would rather die than let it touch you or Nico ever again. What I can promise you is that I will spend every resource I have, every year I have left, protecting the two of you from every version of danger my world could ever produce. And what I can promise you beyond that is that I have never, in 38 years, wanted anything the way I want you standing in my living room right now, terrified and honest and more courageous than any person I have ever met." "That's a lot of pressure to put on one conversation," Elena said, half laughing despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "I've had 13 years of silence to make up for," Damiano said. "I don't intend to waste any more of it being careful." He reached up, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face with a gentleness that seemed entirely at odds with everything the city whispered about the Winter King. "May I kiss you, Elena?" "Yes," she breathed, before her rational mind could catch up with the word. The kiss, when it came, was nothing like she'd expected from a man of his reputation. Not demanding, not possessive, but achingly, devastatingly gentle, as if he were afraid that anything rougher might shatter the fragile, hard-won trust she'd extended him. Elena felt 17 years of careful, exhausted solitude dissolve in the space of that single kiss, felt herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, being held rather than holding, being cared for rather than caring. And when they finally broke apart, both of them slightly breathless, she found herself laughing, a real, unguarded laugh that startled them both. "What?" Damiano asked, smiling, actually smiling, an expression that transformed his cold, hard features into something Elena suspected very few people in his life had ever been permitted to see. "Nothing," Elena said. "It's just, the city calls you the Winter King. If they could see you now." "They will never see me now," Damiano said, pulling her gently back against his chest, his voice dropping into something low and warm and entirely private. This is the only part of my life I intend to keep entirely for myself. Everyone else gets the Winter King. You get whatever this is, whatever's left underneath." "And what's underneath?" Elena asked softly, her cheek against his chest, listening to the steady, unhurried beat of his heart. "A man who has been cold for 13 years, Damiano said, because it was easier than feeling anything at all. "A man who is done being cold, Elena, because of you, and because of our son, and because I have decided, 13 years too late, but decided all the same, that I would rather feel everything, even the terrifying parts, than spend one more day being nothing at all." Outside, far below, the city carried on its usual dangerous rhythms, indifferent to the quiet, hard-won peace being built 4 floors up in a penthouse that had spent 13 years as a monument to grief and was becoming, slowly, something else entirely. Neither of them knew, in that fragile, golden moment, that Salvatore Calabrese had, 3 days earlier, finally located the precise, unguarded window of vulnerability he'd been patiently waiting for, and that the storm gathering on the horizon was about to break over all three of their lives with a violence that would test every promise Damiano Vitale had just made. Word of Damiano Vitale's reunion with his son could not, of course, stay contained forever within the careful circle of people who'd been present for it. By the 6-week mark, whispers had begun moving through the underworld's private channels of communication, first as rumour, then as confirmation trickled through corrupted lab technicians and loose-lipped lawyers, as accepted fact. Damiano's own organisation reacted with a complicated mixture of relief and unease. Relief because a confirmed heir stabilised succession questions that had quietly worried the Vitale family's senior capos for over a decade. Unease because Nico Marchetti, a 17-year-old boy raised entirely outside their world, with a nurse mother and a public school education, and apparently zero interest in or knowledge of the family business, represented an unknown variable in an organisation that did not, as a rule, tolerate unknown variables gracefully. Damiano's younger cousin, Salvatore, no relation to the rival Calabrese Salvatore, a coincidence of names that had caused no shortage of confusion over the years, was the one who finally requested, with careful diplomatic phrasing, a formal family dinner to meet the boy properly. "They need to see him," Salvatore Vitale told Damiano over drinks in the penthouse study. "Not for your sake, for his. If he's going to be part of this family, and Damiano, whether he wants the business or not, he's your blood, so he's part of this family, whether anyone likes it or not. The men need to look him in the eye. They need to see he's not a liability. They need to see you handling this correctly." Damiano understood the logic, even as it filled him with dread. Elena, when he raised the idea with her, understood it too, though her dread ran considerably deeper. "You're asking me to bring my son to a dinner with mafia capos," she said flatly, over coffee in her own kitchen, the ordinary domesticity of the setting throwing the surreal nature of the conversation into sharp relief. "I need you to understand how insane that sentence is, Damiano. I have spent 17 years keeping him as far away from anything resembling danger as humanly possible." "I know," Damiano said, "and I would never ask this if I thought there was any alternative. But Elena, the alternative, the organisation perceiving Nico as vulnerable, as an unprotected variable, is significantly more dangerous than one carefully controlled, heavily secured dinner where he's introduced properly, under my protection, in a setting where every person present understands exactly whose son he is and exactly what will happen to anyone who threatens him." "And if he doesn't want this life, what happens then?" "Then he doesn't have this life," Damiano said, with a certainty that surprised her. "Elena, I built an organisation. I did not inherit an obligation to force my son into a role he doesn't want. If Nico wants to go to college, become an engineer, live a life entirely separate from mine, I will support that with everything I have. And I will make certain for the rest of my life that the danger of my world never touches him, regardless of his choice. But right now, tonight, whether he wants this life or not, he needs to be seen and acknowledged by the people who could otherwise become a threat to him. That protection has to come first." Elena, against every instinct she possessed, agreed. The dinner took place 2 weeks later at a private estate in Westchester, in a dining room that could have comfortably seated 40, but held that evening only 14. Damiano's most senior capos, their wives, Salvatore Vitale and his own young family, and, at the head of the table beside Damiano, Nico and Elena. Nico, to Elena's simultaneous pride and alarm, handled the evening with a composure that startled everyone present, including his own father. He answered the careful, probing questions about his education, his interests, his plans for the future, with a directness that bordered on defiance. And when one older capo, a heavy-set man named Fabrizio, testing the boy's mettle with the deliberate provocation of men accustomed to sizing up potential threats, asked pointedly whether Nico intended to take his rightful place in the family business. Nico looked the man dead in the eye and said, with a calm that made Elena's heart swell with fierce, complicated pride, "I intend to become an engineer. I want to design bridges, not run them. If that's a problem for anyone at this table, they can take it up with my father, because I understand he's the one who decides who gets a problem with me." Silence fell over the table. Then, to Elena's considerable relief, Damiano laughed, a genuine, surprised laugh, and raised his wineglass. "To my son," he said, "who apparently inherited his mother's spine, since God knows he didn't get it from me." The table laughed, tension broken, and Elena felt Damiano's hand find hers beneath the tablecloth, squeezing gently, in silent gratitude and affection. But not every face at that table was smiling. Fabrizio's expression, when Elena glanced his way a moment later, held something colder and more calculating than simple deference, a look she recognized, with a chill she couldn't quite explain, from certain difficult patients' families over the years, the look of someone quietly, carefully recalculating their own position in light of new information. She mentioned it to Damiano later that night, once they were alone. "Fabrizio's been loyal for 20 years, Damiano said, though a slight frown had crossed his face at her description. "But you're right to notice these things, Elena. That instinct, that's exactly why I need you close. Not just for Nico's sake." "You think he's a threat?" "I think," Damiano said slowly, "that a confirmed heir changes everyone's calculations, on every side of every conflict I've ever had. I'll have Ferreira look into it. In the meantime," he pulled her closer, his expression softening from calculation into something warmer, more private. "In the meantime, I would like to stop talking about capos and threats and spend the rest of this evening reminding myself what it feels like to be simply, uncomplicatedly happy, if you'll let me." Elena, despite the cold unease Fabrizio's expression had left in her chest, found she could not refuse him. What neither of them yet knew was that Fabrizio's calculating glance had nothing to do with any ambition of his own, and everything to do with a message he'd received only that morning from an old associate now working quietly for Salvatore Calabrese, offering a sum of money large enough to guarantee silence about a small piece of information Fabrizio had overheard weeks earlier: the address, the schedule, and the security gaps of a nurse named Elena Marchetti's apartment building in Astoria. The first sign that something had shifted came 3 days after the Westchester dinner, in the form of a single white rose left on the windshield of Elena's car, parked in the clinic's staff lot. There was no note. There didn't need to be one. Elena stood in the parking lot for a long moment, staring at the rose, feeling an old animal fear crawl up her spine. The same fear, she realized with sick clarity, that she'd successfully suppressed for 17 years. ever since a wordless 4-year-old had clutched her sleeve in a room that smelled of bleach and instant coffee. She called Damiano immediately. He arrived at the clinic within 20 minutes, having apparently abandoned an important meeting mid-sentence, and his face, when he examined the rose, went white with a controlled fury Elena had not yet seen from him. "This is Calabrese," he said flatly. "This exact gesture, a white rose, no note, it's a signature. Salvatore's father used it decades ago, before I was even born, as a way of telling a target, I know where you are, and I want you to know that I know."
Damiano, who is Salvatore Calabrese, and why does he know where I park my car?
Damiano's jaw tightened. For a long moment he said nothing, and Elena watched him wrestle visibly with a decision he had clearly, deliberately, been avoiding for weeks. "Sit down," he said finally. "I need to tell you something I should have told you weeks ago, and I am sorry, genuinely, deeply sorry, that I didn't." He told her everything then, standing in a clinic parking lot with a white rose between them like a small, silent bomb. Salvatore Calabrese's decades-long rivalry with the Vitale family, the intermediary inside Damiano's own organization who had orchestrated Nico's kidnapping 13 years ago on Salvatore's orders in a plot to destabilize Damiano's succession and clear a path toward eventual Calabrese dominance. The botched ransom handoff that had led to Nico's abandonment in that Queen's stairwell, abandonment that had, however traumatically, ultimately kept him alive and hidden, safe from a threat he'd never known existed for 13 crucial years. The bicycle accident, which Damiano now believed, based on Ferreira's ongoing investigation, had been Salvatore's clumsy first attempt to eliminate the resurfaced threat before its full significance was confirmed. Elena listened to all of it in a silence that grew colder and more furious with every revelation, until finally, when Damiano finished, she said in a voice shaking with barely controlled rage, "You knew. You knew there was a chance the accident that broke my son's collarbone was a deliberate attempt on his life, and you didn't tell me." "I didn't have proof," Damiano said. "I had suspicion, and I didn't want to terrify you with an unconfirmed fear while you were already reeling from everything else I'd thrown at your life in the same week." "That wasn't your decision to make!" Elena's voice cracked, fury and fear tangling together into something raw and dangerous. "You don't get to decide what I can handle, Damiano. I have spent 17 years being the only person standing between my son and every danger this world could throw at him, and you took that decision away from me. You left me walking around blind to a threat that could have killed him, because you wanted to protect me from being afraid?" "Yes," Damiano said. And there was no apology in his voice now, only a fierce, uncompromising honesty. "Yes, Elena, I did that. And if I had to make the same choice again today, knowing everything I know now, I would still choose to shoulder that fear myself rather than hand it to you before I had to. That is not me taking away your agency. That is me loving you enough to carry something heavy so you don't have to carry it alone. You have spent 17 years being the only person protecting Nico. I am asking you to let that be different now. I am asking you to let me carry some of this with you instead of watching you carry everything alone the way you always have." Elena's fury faltered, caught on the raw sincerity in his voice, though the fear underneath it remained sharp and unresolved. "I don't know how to do that," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to let someone else carry it.
I've never had that option before.
I know, Damiano said gently, stepping closer, his hand finding hers. I know this is new and terrifying, and I am asking a great deal of you all at once. But Elena, look at me. I am not going to let anything happen to Nico or to you. I have already lost 13 years I can never get back. I am not losing one more day, and I am certainly not losing either of you to a man who has already cost me more than he will ever understand. From this point forward, you have full security detail around the clock, whether you want it or not. Nico moves with protection at all times. I am not negotiating on this point, Elena, not with Salvatore Calabrese circling, and not with you. Elena, exhausted, terrified, furious, and, despite everything, deeply, undeniably in love with the man standing in front of her, finally, wearily, nodded.
Fine, she said, but you tell me everything from now on. Every threat, every suspicion, every white rose on every windshield. I don't care how much it scares me. I would rather be scared and informed than protected and blind. Do you understand me, Damiano? Yes, Damiano said, I understand. I promise you, from this moment forward, everything. He kept his word in the days that followed, briefing her thoroughly on Ferreira's mounting investigation into Fabrizio's suspected disloyalty, on the increased security measures being implemented around both Elena's apartment and Nico's school, on the careful, deliberate steps his organization was taking to prepare for a conflict with the Calabrese family that now seemed grimly inevitable. What he did not yet know, what even Ferreira's considerable resources had not yet uncovered, was that Fabrizio had already, 3 days earlier, provided Salvatore Calabrese's people with something far more dangerous than a symbolic white rose. The exact date and time of an upcoming, lightly attended school event. A parent-teacher conference at Nico's high school, where security protocols, still being finalized, would leave a narrow, exploitable gap of exactly 40 minutes. The gap, when it came, arrived on a Wednesday afternoon that began deceptively like any other. Elena had insisted on attending Nico's parent-teacher conference alone, a small, ordinary act of maternal normalcy that she'd clung to fiercely amid the surrounding chaos, refusing to let Damiano's security apparatus swallow every last remaining piece of her old, uncomplicated life. Damiano had agreed, reluctantly, on the condition that 2 of his men, a pair of quiet, watchful professionals named Rocco and Enzo, a coincidence of names Damiano found almost unbearably poignant, would remain stationed discreetly outside the school throughout the appointment. What none of them accounted for was that Salvatore Calabrese, growing impatient with weeks of careful, unproductive waiting, had decided that a direct strike against Elena Marchetti herself, not Nico, whose heavy security had become genuinely, frustratingly impenetrable, but the woman whose safety Damiano Vitale had made so publicly, so uncharacteristically central to his own emotional well-being, represented the more accessible and arguably more devastating target. Eleanor left the conference at 4:15 p.m. Walking the short distance from the school's main entrance to the visitor parking lot where her car waited, her mind still comfortably occupied with the ordinary pleasure of a teacher's genuine praise for Nico's engineering aptitude. She did not notice the grey sedan idling at the lot's far edge until it was already moving, accelerating directly toward her
with a speed that left no ambiguity about its intent. Rocco saw it first. He was already moving, weapon drawn, shouting a warning that Elena, frozen for one terrible half-second by pure animal shock, barely registered before he collided with her bodily, throwing them both clear of the sedan's path, a half-second before it would have struck her directly.
The car clipped a parked minivan instead, hard enough to spin it sideways, and two men emerged from its rear doors with a speed and coordination that spoke of extensive professional training. What followed was 11 of the most terrifying seconds of Elena Marchetti's life. Rocco returned fire immediately, taking cover behind a concrete parking bollard, shouting into a radio for Enzo and for emergency backup simultaneously. One of the attackers went down almost immediately, caught by Rocco's second shot. The other, undeterred, continued advancing toward Elena with a directness that made her blood run to ice, until Enzo, arriving at a dead sprint from the school's opposite entrance, tackled him from the side with enough force to send them both sprawling across the asphalt. By the time the grey sedan's driver, recognizing the operation's total collapse, abandoned his remaining men and fled the scene at reckless speed, the entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds. Elena found herself on the ground, Rocco's protective weight still covering her, her ears ringing, her hands shaking so badly she couldn't immediately process that she was, miraculously, entirely uninjured. "Miss Marchetti." Rocco's voice, when it finally penetrated the ringing in her ears, was tight with controlled urgency. "Miss Marchetti, are you hurt? Can you hear me?" Elena's own voice came out strange and distant. "I'm fine. I think I'm fine. Nico. Where's Nico? He was still inside for his last conference block. Is he?" "He's secure," Rocco said immediately. "Second team's already moving him to the penthouse. He never left the building. This was specifically targeting you, Miss Marchetti. We need to move you now, before local police arrive and this becomes significantly more complicated to manage." Damiano arrived at the penthouse 40 minutes later, having driven from a downtown meeting at a speed that left his own driver white-knuckled and silent, to find Elena sitting on his living room sofa, wrapped in a blanket someone had produced, her hands still trembling around a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, while Nico sat pressed against her side with the pale, wide-eyed terror of a teenager who had just learned, in the most visceral possible way, exactly how dangerous his father's world could be. Damiano crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt in front of Elena. His own hands, Elena noticed with distant surprise, shaking nearly as badly as hers. "Elena." His voice broke completely on her name. "Elena, look at me. Are you hurt? Tell me the truth." "I'm fine," Elena said, and then, without warning, burst into tears. Not the composed, quiet tears of the earlier weeks, but something raw and total. 17 years of careful control finally completely giving way. "I'm fine, Damiano. But they came for me. They actually came for me. And Rocco had to. There was a man with a gun, and Rocco threw himself in front of me, and I thought I was going to die in a parking lot and never see Nico again, and—" Damiano pulled her into his arms with a fierceness that left no room for gentleness, holding her so tightly she could feel his heart hammering against her own chest. And for a long moment neither of them spoke at all, simply held each other in the aftermath of a horror that had come devastatingly, unbearably close to unmaking everything they'd built together. "I am so sorry," Damiano said finally, his voice thick with an emotion that sounded, to Elena's astonishment, dangerously close to his own tears. "I am so sorry, Elena. This is my world. This is the danger I dragged into your life, into Nico's life. And I promised you I would protect you, and I nearly—" His voice broke entirely. "I nearly lost you, both of you, in the same afternoon. I have never been so afraid in my entire life. And I have buried men with my own hands, Elena. I did not know I still had this much fear left in me until I got the call that a car had targeted you outside Nico's school." "It's not your fault," Elena said, though her voice still shook. "You didn't do this. Salvatore Calabrese did this." "It is my fault that you're in danger at all," Damiano said fiercely. "It has always been my fault. My father's enemies became my enemies, became Nico's enemies, became yours. And none of you asked for any of it, and I am done. Elena, I am completely, absolutely done, pretending that careful half measures are enough to keep you both safe. This ends now. I am going to end this war with Salvatore Calabrese permanently, one way or another, and I need you to trust me enough to let me do whatever that requires." Elena looked up at him, at the raw, terrifying resolve in his eyes, and felt, underneath her own residual terror, a fierce, protective love rising to match it. "Then let me help," she said. "I've spent 17 years being underestimated by people who thought a nurse from Bensonhurst didn't have any fight in her. I'm done being protected from every decision, Damiano. Whatever you're planning, I want to know, and I want to be part of ending this, because I absolutely refuse to spend one more day looking over my shoulder in a parking lot." Across the room, Nico, who had listened to this entire exchange in pale, silent shock, finally spoke, his voice steadier than either adult expected. "I want to help too," he said. "Whatever this is, whatever it takes. Nobody gets to do that to my mom and just walk away from it." Damiano looked between the two people he loved most in the world, the woman who had raised his son through 17 years of quiet, unglamorous sacrifice, and the boy who had inherited, unmistakably, her fierce, unshakable spine, and felt something in his chest settle, finally, into grim, determined clarity. "All right," he said. "Then let's finish this. All of us. Together." Ferreira delivered the confirmation Damiano had been dreading 2 days later, in the fortified security of the penthouse's private study, with a folder of evidence he laid on the desk, with the grim reluctance of a man about to deliver news he wished, personally, he could unknow. "It's Fabrizio," Ferreira said. "Confirmed. Financial records show 3 transfers over the past 6 weeks from a shell account linked directly to Salvatore Calabrese's known money laundering network. The timing lines up exactly. The first transfer 2 days after the Westchester dinner, the second the day before the school ambush. Damiano, he sold you out. 20 years of loyalty, and he sold you out for $800,000. Damiano sat perfectly still for a long moment, his face carved from something colder and harder than Elena had yet seen from him, even in the raw aftermath of the parking lot ambush. "Bring him to me," he said finally, his voice devoid of any inflection at all. "Quietly. Tonight. I want to look him in the eye myself." "Damiano," Ferreira's voice carried a note of careful caution. "You understand what happens once you do that. There's no walking this back." "I understand exactly what happens," Damiano said.
20 years of loyalty bought my patience, Aldo. It did not buy him a second chance at putting Elena's life at risk. Bring him to me. Elena, who had insisted on being present for this conversation, despite Damiano's evident reluctance, felt a chill move through her at the flat, absolute finality in his voice. A chill that deepened considerably when Fabrizio was brought 2 hours later into the same study, flanked by 2 of Damiano's most trusted men. His face already grey with the particular fear of a man who understood, without being told, exactly how thoroughly he'd been caught. What followed was not, in the end, the violence Elena had braced herself for. Damiano, standing across the desk from a man he'd known and trusted for 2 decades, asked a single, quiet question. Why? Fabrizio's composure cracked entirely. My daughter, he said, his voice breaking. Damiano, my daughter needed a transplant, a kidney, and the insurance wouldn't cover the experimental procedure, and Salvatore's people approached me, and I told myself it was just information, just a schedule, nothing that would actually... I didn't know they meant to hurt her, Damiano. I swear to you. I thought it was leverage. I thought... You thought wrong, Damiano said, his voice quiet and terrible. You thought wrong twice, Fabrizio. Once when you believed information given to men like Salvatore Calabrese could ever remain harmless. And once, when you believed I would not find out. Elena watched Damiano's face, searching for the ruthless violence the city's whispers had led her to expect, and found instead something more complicated, a controlled, exhausted grief, the particular pain of a man forced to reckon with a betrayal from someone he genuinely, personally trusted. Your daughter's surgery, Damiano said finally, will be paid for, in full, by my own funds, effective tomorrow morning, regardless of what happens to you tonight. She did not choose her father's mistakes, and she will not suffer for them. Fabrizio's face crumpled with a grief and gratitude too complicated to fully process. Damiano, I don't... Why would you? Because I am not Salvatore Calabrese, Damiano said. I do not punish children for their parents' failures. But you, Fabrizio, you sold the location of a woman I love to men who tried to kill her in a parking lot in front of my son's school. There is no version of this conversation where you remain part of my organization, and there is no version of this conversation where I simply let that betrayal go unanswered. You will tell my men everything you know about Salvatore's current operations, his security arrangements, his plans, everything, in full, tonight. And in exchange, your daughter's medical care will be provided, regardless of your cooperation, because I do not use a sick child as leverage, even against the man who nearly cost me everything. But you will leave this city by morning, Fabrizio, and you will never return. And if I ever see your face again, I promise you, the mercy I am extending tonight will not extend twice. It was, Elena realized, watching this exchange unfold with a complicated mixture of horror and reluctant respect. A kind of justice she hadn't expected from a man of Damiano's reputation. Brutal in its finality, but tempered by a code of honor that refused to visit a father's sins on an innocent child, even as it refused to let that same father's betrayal go unanswered. Fabrizio, given no real alternative, talked. He talked for 3 hours, providing Ferreira and Damiano's security team with a detailed map of Salvatore Calabrese's current operations: his primary residence, his security rotation, his secondary properties, the exact structure of his organization's most vulnerable pressure points. By the time Fabrizio was escorted from the building, alive, disgraced, but genuinely, mercifully spared, Damiano had what he needed to end the war Salvatore Calabrese had started 13 years earlier, in a nursery, with an open window and a stolen child. "What happens now?" Elena asked quietly, once they were alone again, the study feeling suddenly oppressively silent after hours of tension. "Now," Damiano said, his voice grim with a resolve that frightened and reassured her in equal measure. "I finish what he started. Not with more kidnappings, not with more violence against people who never asked to be involved. With something Salvatore Calabrese understands far better than mercy. I take away everything he has left to lose, until he no longer has the resources to be a threat to anyone I love ever again." "And if he doesn't go quietly?" Damiano's expression, when he answered, held no doubt at all. "Then I finish this the way he started it 13 years ago," he said. "Except this time, Elena, I am not the frightened father searching an empty nursery. This time, I am the man who has already lost everything once and found it again, and I promise you completely that I will burn Salvatore Calabrese's entire world to the ground before I let him take it from me a second time." The following week passed in a blur of quiet, coordinated intensity that reminded Elena, in its strange way, of preparing a hospital for an incoming mass casualty event, the same grim, focused efficiency, the same absence of panic in favor of methodical, disciplined preparation. Damiano's organization mobilized with a precision that impressed and unsettled her in equal measure. Security around both her apartment and Nico's school tripled, then tripled again, until Elena found herself surrounded at all times by a quiet, professional presence that felt less like a cage and more, gradually, like the strange, unfamiliar comfort of being genuinely, thoroughly protected for the first time in her adult life. She insisted, over Damiano's initial objections, on staying informed of every development. He honoured that promise, briefing her each evening on the shifting landscape of the conflict. Salvatore Calabrese's mounting desperation as his own organization's vulnerabilities were systematically exposed and exploited. His increasingly reckless attempts to salvage a position that was, day by day, becoming untenable. "He's cornered," Damiano told her one evening, spreading a series of documents across his study desk with the controlled intensity of a general reviewing a battle plan. "Cornered men make mistakes. Fabrizio's information gave us his entire financial network. We've already frozen or seized access to nearly 60% of his liquid assets through channels I won't bore you with the specifics of. His own capos are beginning to question his judgment. Within days, possibly hours, he'll either surrender the conflict entirely or he'll do something reckless and desperate. Which do you think it'll be?" Damiano's expression when he answered was grim. "Reckless," he said. "A man like Salvatore doesn't know how to lose gracefully. He spent 13 years believing he'd successfully buried the consequences of a crime he committed against a 3-year-old child. Watching that crime resurface, watching his entire carefully constructed advantage collapse in a matter of weeks, that's not a defeat a man like him absorbs quietly. Nico, who had insisted, with his father's own stubborn determination, on being included in these briefings rather than shielded from them, spoke up from the corner of the study where he'd been listening with careful, focused attention. What does reckless actually mean, though? Like, specifically, what's he going to try? Damiano studied his son for a long moment, visible pride and reluctance warring in his expression.
Specifically, he said finally, it means he may attempt a direct strike against one of us, rather than continuing an indirect campaign that's clearly failing. It means increased security for all three of us, effective immediately. And it means I need both of you to trust the protocols my team has established, even when they feel excessive. You're talking about him coming after me again, Elena said quietly. Or Nico. I'm talking about being prepared for every possibility, Damiano said, so that if he does try something desperate, we are positioned to end this conflict decisively, rather than reactively. I have spent 13 years living in the aftermath of one moment of unpreparedness. I am not making that mistake twice. It was during this tense, watchful week that Elena found herself, unexpectedly, growing closer to Damiano in ways that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with the particular intimacy of shared crisis. Long nights reviewing security protocols together, quiet conversations about contingency plans that somehow, gradually, became conversations about their shared future, about what a life together might look like once this immediate danger had passed. I keep thinking, Elena admitted one night, unable to sleep, sitting with Damiano on the same terrace where he'd first told her she was everything, about what happens after. If we survive this, when we survive this, I mean, because I refuse to consider the alternative. What does a life together actually look like, Damiano? I'm a nurse. You run an empire that apparently requires freezing rival financial networks and negotiating with traitors. I don't know how those two lives fit together. They fit together, Damiano said, the same way they've fit together for the past 2 months. Imperfectly, complicatedly, but genuinely. I am not asking you to become someone you're not, Elena. I fell in love with a nurse who works double shifts and clips coupons and gave up 17 years of her own comfort for a child that wasn't biologically hers. I have no interest in changing a single thing about that woman. I only want the chance to make sure she never has to sacrifice that much again, unless it's a sacrifice she chooses freely, for reasons that have nothing to do with survival. And Nico? What does his life look like in all this? Whatever he chooses, Damiano said simply. I meant that at the Westchester dinner, and I mean it now. If he wants to build bridges instead of running an empire, then that is exactly what he will do, with my complete support, and with enough security to ensure that choice is genuinely available to him, rather than a fantasy he abandons out of necessity. Elena leaned into him, the tension of the week finally, briefly, allowing her a moment of quiet peace. I love you, she said softly, the words arriving with an ease that would have seemed impossible 3 months earlier. I need you to know that, regardless of what happens next. Whatever Salvatore Calabrese tries, whatever it costs to end this, I love you, Damiano. Not the Winter King the city whispers about. You, the man who cried, holding a stuffed wolf, and drove himself to a restaurant to watch me have dinner with someone else because he couldn't bear the alternative, and paid for a traitor's daughter's surgery even while ending that traitor's career permanently. That man. I love that man completely.
Damiano's arms tightened around her, his voice, when it came, rough, with an emotion he made no effort to hide. "I love you," he said, "more than I have ever loved anything in my life, except the son we share. And I promise you, Elena, whatever Salvatore Calabrese attempts in the days ahead, I will end this conflict. And I will build the rest of my life around making sure you never regret loving a man like me." Neither of them could have known, sitting on that terrace with the city glittering below them, that Salvatore Calabrese's final, desperate gambit was already being set into motion. A plan so reckless, so absolute, that it would bring the entire fragile peace they'd been building crashing down within 48 hours. Salvatore Calabrese, by the time his final plan crystallized, had lost nearly everything that had once made him formidable. His financial network lay in ruins, frozen or seized through channels his own lawyers couldn't fully untangle. His capos, sensing the tide had turned decisively against him, had begun the quiet, self-preserving process of distancing themselves from a losing war. He had, in the span of 2 weeks, gone from a man capable of ordering a coordinated ambush outside a suburban high school to a man with barely enough loyal muscle left to mount one final, desperate operation. But desperate men, as Damiano had warned, were the most dangerous kind, precisely because they had nothing left to lose. Salvatore's final plan was elegant in its brutal simplicity. Rather than continuing to target Elena or Nico directly, both now protected by security levels that had become, in Ferreira's professional assessment, genuinely close to impenetrable, he would strike at the one remaining point of leverage that Damiano's careful preparations hadn't fully anticipated: a charity gala held annually at a hotel ballroom on the Upper East Side, that Damiano had attended every year for over a decade as a matter of public reputation management, and which he had, this year, for the first time in 13 years, planned to attend with his son and the woman he loved, standing publicly, proudly, by his side. It was, Salvatore reasoned correctly, exactly the kind of event Damiano would refuse to abandon or reschedule, because doing so would signal weakness, would suggest that Salvatore Calabrese's campaign of intimidation had succeeded in constraining Damiano Vitale's life, a perception Damiano's pride and his organization's stability could not afford to allow. And it was, Salvatore knew, an event with a guest list of nearly 400 people, a logistical security nightmare that no amount of careful planning could fully close every gap within. Damiano, for his part, understood the trap even as he walked into it, because the alternative, hiding indefinitely from a threat he intended to end permanently within weeks, was simply not a life he was willing to build with the people he loved. "I know it's a risk," he told Elena, 2 days before the gala, as his security team finalized what was, by any measure, an extraordinary logistical operation to protect 3 people at a 400-guest public event. "But Elena, if we hide from this, we hide from every future event for the rest of our lives, waiting for a threat that Salvatore's own organization is already abandoning him over. I would rather end this decisively, on our own terms, than spend years looking over our shoulders at every public appearance." "And if something goes wrong?" "Then Rocco and Enzo and 40 other men, whose only job tonight is keeping the 3 of us alive, will do exactly what they're paid extraordinarily well to do," Damiano said. "I am not walking into this blind, Elena. I am walking into this with more security surrounding us than most heads of state receive. But I understand your fear, and if you would prefer to stay home— No, Elena said immediately, with a fierce, unshakable resolve that had, over the past weeks, become as familiar to Damiano as her laugh. No, if you're walking into this, so am I. So is Nico. We finish this together, or we don't finish it at all. The gala, on the night itself, unfolded with a glittering, deceptive normalcy, a ballroom full of New York's wealthiest and most powerful families, an orchestra, waiters circulating with champagne, the ordinary, glamorous theatre of high society, entirely unaware of the war being quietly fought beneath its polished surface. Elena wore a deep emerald gown Damiano had insisted on providing, standing beside him with Nico on her other side, both of them uncomfortably aware of the security presence woven invisibly to the other guests throughout every corner of the room. She smiled through introductions to men and women whose names she'd only ever read in society pages, her pulse hammering beneath a composed exterior, watching every door, every unfamiliar face, with the hyper-vigilant attention of a woman who had learned in the past 2 months exactly how quickly glittering normalcy could shatter into violence. It happened just after 11, during the gala's formal dinner service, when a catering staff member, a man who had, Ferreira would later confirm, been hired only 3 days earlier through a temp agency with lax verification standards, exactly the kind of gap Salvatore's people had been searching for, approached the head table with a tray of desserts and, instead of serving them, drew a concealed weapon and fired directly at Damiano Vitale from a distance of 6 feet. The bullet, aimed true, would have ended Damiano's life instantly, had Rocco, positioned by Damiano's explicit instruction closer to the head table than protocol strictly required, precisely because he had never fully recovered from his own guilt over the parking lot ambush, and had refused to relax his vigilance for a single moment since, not thrown himself bodily into the shooter's path, a fraction of a second before the trigger fully depressed. The bullet took Rocco in the shoulder instead of Damiano's chest. Chaos erupted instantly. Screaming guests, overturned tables, Ferreira's security team moving with brutal, coordinated speed to subdue the shooter, while simultaneously forming a protective wall around Damiano, Elena, and Nico. Elena, every instinct trained over a decade of medical practice overriding her own fear, was on her knees beside Rocco within seconds, applying pressure to the wound with the composed, clinical efficiency that had defined her entire career, shouting instructions to the nearest security personnel about elevation and pressure, and calling for the ambulance that Damiano's team, with grim foresight, had already staged 2 blocks away for exactly this contingency. "Stay with me, Rocco," she said fiercely, her hands slick with his blood, her voice steady despite the chaos exploding around her. "You threw yourself in front of a bullet meant for the man I love, and I am not letting you die on a ballroom floor. Stay with me." Damiano, kneeling on Rocco's other side, his own hands shaking with an adrenaline that had nothing to do with fear for himself and everything to do with watching a man take a bullet meant for him, looked up and found the shooter, subdued and restrained by 3 of Ferreira's men, staring back at him with the particular, defeated resignation of a man who understood exactly how thoroughly his employer's final gambit had failed. "Where's Salvatore?" Damiano said, his voice carrying a controlled, terrible fury that silenced the surrounding chaos for a moment. "Tell me where Salvatore Calabrese is right now, and I promise you, whatever mercy exists in this situation, it exists only for the man who tells me the truth in the next 10 seconds. The shooter, whose name turned out to be a minor Calabrese associate named Tommy Russo, talked within minutes, motivated by a survival instinct that outweighed whatever loyalty Salvatore Calabrese's remaining resources could still command. "He's not even in the city," Russo said, his voice shaking, restrained on the ballroom floor while paramedics worked on Rocco a few feet away and hotel security struggled uselessly to manage a crime scene that had already been thoroughly claimed by Damiano's own people. "He's at the lake house, Putnam County. He told me if this worked, I should meet him thereafter to collect the rest of the payment."
He said this was the last play he had left, that if it didn't work, he was done anyway. So he might as well go out trying.
Damiano straightened, his expression settling into something absolutely, coldly final. "Ferreira," he said, "get Rocco to the hospital and get Elena and Nico back to the penthouse with full security immediately. I'm going to Putnam County." "Damiano!" Ferreira's voice carried a note of genuine alarm. "You can't go there yourself. Let the team handle this. You've got a woman and a son who need you here, tonight, after everything that just happened." "I have spent 13 years, Damiano said, his voice low and absolutely unwavering, letting other men finish my fights, while I stayed carefully insulated from the consequences of my own war. That ends tonight. Salvatore Calabrese took my son from a nursery when he was 3 years old. He nearly killed the woman I love in a parking lot. He just tried to have me shot at a charity gala in front of 400 witnesses, and instead put a bullet in a man who has done nothing but protect my family for weeks. I am not sending other men to finish this. I am ending it myself." Elena, blood-streaked and shaking with adrenaline, grabbed his arm before he could turn away. "Damiano, look at me. If you go there alone, in this state, you are not thinking clearly. You're grieving and furious and running on pure instinct, and that is exactly how good men make fatal mistakes." "Elena." "I'm not telling you not to go," Elena said fiercely. "I understand exactly why you have to. But you take Ferreira and you take a full team and you do this the way you've done everything else in the past 2 weeks, carefully, deliberately, with every advantage stacked in your favor. I did not fall in love with a reckless man, Damiano. I fell in love with a man who thinks 3 steps ahead of everyone else in every room he's ever walked into. Be that man tonight. Don't be the wounded animal Salvatore is hoping he provoked." Damiano looked at her for a long moment, something in his expression shifting from raw, grief-fueled fury into the colder, more controlled resolve she'd first glimpsed in a hospital waiting room months earlier. The Winter King, reclaiming himself in the exact moment it mattered most. "You're right," he said finally. "You're right. And I love you for seeing it, even now, even after everything that just happened tonight." He turned to Ferreira. "Full team. We do this properly. And Aldo, get me eyes on that lake house before we move an inch closer. I want to know exactly what we're walking into before we walk into it." The operation that followed, conducted with the same disciplined, methodical precision that had characterized every step of Damiano's campaign against Salvatore Calabrese over the preceding 2 weeks, took 4 hours to properly stage. Ferreira's reconnaissance confirmed Salvatore was alone at the lake house, except for 2 remaining loyal men, a skeleton crew, a far cry from the small army that had once surrounded the head of a rival crime family. Evidence of just how thoroughly his organization had abandoned him in the wake of his campaign's public, humiliating collapse. They moved at dawn. What followed was less a battle than a formality. Salvatore Calabrese's two remaining men surrendered within minutes of Ferreira's team breaching the property's perimeter, unwilling to die for a boss who had, by every visible measure, already lost everything worth fighting for. Salvatore himself was found in the lake house's study, sitting alone at a desk with a bottle of scotch and a handgun he had not, in the end, found the courage to use on himself. Damiano entered the room alone, over Ferreira's strenuous objections, and stood for a long moment looking at the man who had destroyed 13 years of his life with a single decision made in a moment of political calculation decades ago that had cost far more than either of them could have imagined at the time. "You took my son from his nursery," Damiano said finally, his voice quiet, devoid of the fury that had consumed him hours earlier, replaced now by something colder and more absolute. "You left him, abandoned in a stairwell, because your own operation panicked and botched a ransom handoff. You spent 13 years believing he was dead, believing you'd successfully buried the consequences of that decision. And when you learned he was alive, rather than accepting the war was already lost, you tried to kill the woman who raised him. And then you tried to kill me, in a room full of 400 witnesses. And instead, you shot a man who has done nothing in his life but serve loyally and protect the people I love." Salvatore, sitting slumped at his desk, looked up with the hollow, defeated eyes of a man who understood he had nothing left to bargain with. "So finish it," he said flatly. "You clearly came here to finish it, Damiano. Stop making speeches and do it." Damiano was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something Salvatore clearly had not expected. "No," Damiano said. "I am not going to kill you, Salvatore." Salvatore's head snapped up, genuine shock breaking through his defeated composure. "You will surrender, fully and completely, to federal authorities," Damiano continued, "for the kidnapping of my son 13 years ago, a crime for which the statute of limitations has not expired, given its classification, and for which I have, over the past 2 weeks, quietly assembled a complete, unimpeachable body of evidence, including Fabrizio's testimony, Tommy Russo's confession, and financial records tracing every payment you made to orchestrate both the original kidnapping and this most recent campaign. You will spend the remainder of your life in federal prison, Salvatore, not as a martyr for some underworld cause, but as exactly what you are, a man who tried to murder a child to preserve his own political position, and failed, completely, at every turn." "Why not just kill me?" Salvatore asked, genuine confusion cutting through his defeat. "Every code either of us has ever operated under says you should. I would have killed you, Damiano, if our positions were reversed." "I know you would have," Damiano said. "That is precisely why I'm not going to. I spent 13 years being defined by what you took from me. I refuse to spend the rest of my life being defined by what I did in response. I have a son who is going to grow up watching how his father handles power, Salvatore, and I want him to see a man who chose justice over vengeance, even when vengeance would have been so much easier and so much more satisfying. That is the only inheritance I have left to give him that actually matters." Rocco survived. The bullet had missed anything vital, and after 2 days in intensive care and a week of recovery, he was sitting up in a private hospital room, receiving a visit from Elena that neither of them would ever forget. "You didn't have to do that," Elena said quietly, sitting beside his bed, her hand resting on his uninjured arm. You didn't have to throw yourself in front of that bullet. Yes, I did, Rocco said simply. That's the job, Ms. Marchetti. But also, he hesitated, something more personal crossing his face. You've become important to this family. To Damiano, obviously, but also to all of us, in a way I don't think you fully realize. Watching you these past few weeks, watching you refuse to let fear stop you from doing what needed to be done, watching you patch up half the security team's minor injuries yourself rather than waiting for a hospital visit, watching you fight for Nico with everything you have. That's not nothing to men like us. We don't often get to protect someone who deserves it as much as you do. Elena felt tears rise, unexpected and overwhelming. Thank you, she said, for saving his life, for saving mine. I don't think I've properly thanked you for either. You just did, Rocco said, smiling despite his obvious pain.
Now go be with your family, Miss Marchetti. I hear there's a lot of celebrating happening that I'm going to be very upset about missing.
Salvatore Calabrese's surrender to federal authorities, arranged quietly through channels Damiano's lawyers had spent the intervening week carefully constructing, made headlines across the city. Not as an underworld war finally concluding, but as a carefully sanitized story about a decades-old kidnapping cold case finally solved. A wealthy businessman's tragic separation from his son, finally, joyfully resolved. The full truth of the mafia conflict beneath that story remained, as such truths generally did, carefully hidden from public record, contained within the private, unofficial channels through which men like Damiano Vitale conducted the parts of their lives the ordinary world never fully saw.
For Nico, the weeks following the gala brought a complicated, gradual reckoning with exactly what world he'd been born into and exactly what world he'd been raised in instead. He spent hours in quiet conversation with Damiano, working through questions that had no easy answers. About violence, about justice, about the strange, uncomfortable balance between the father who had built an empire through methods Nico was still learning to fully understand, and the mother who had raised him with nothing but unwavering, uncomplicated love. "Do you regret it?" Nico asked his father one evening, the two of them sitting on the same terrace where Damiano had first confessed his love to Elena. Not killing him. Salvatore. Everyone says that's not how this world works, that mercy gets you killed eventually. Damiano considered the question seriously, the way he'd come to consider most of his son's questions over the preceding weeks. "I don't regret it," he said finally. "I've killed men before, Nico. I won't pretend otherwise to you, because you deserve honesty more than you deserve a comfortable story. But every time I did, it cost me something. Some small piece of whatever capacity for genuine peace I might otherwise have kept. I am 50, 38 years old, and I have spent most of my adult life being feared rather than loved. And I am only now, because of your mother, beginning to understand what I gave up by choosing that path so completely. I don't regret sparing Salvatore, because sparing him is the first time in years I chose who I wanted to be, rather than who this world expected me to become. I would like you to have that example, even if you never need it, even if you build the entirely different life I hope you build." "I don't hate you," Nico said quietly, after a long pause. "I thought I might when I first learned all this, but I don't. I think—" He hesitated, working through something complicated. "I think you're trying, in your own complicated way, to be a good father."
even though the world you built is so far from anything I understood or wanted for myself. I can see that you're trying." "That means more to me," Damiano said, his voice rough with emotion, "than anything else you could possibly say." Elena, meanwhile, found herself navigating her own complicated recovery. Not just from the physical shock of the parking lot ambush and the gala shooting, but from the deeper, more disorienting process of building a genuine future with a man whose world had, twice now, come devastatingly close to costing her everything. "I keep thinking about what almost happened," she admitted to Damiano one night, unable to sleep, the memory of Rocco's blood on her hands still vivid despite the passage of days. "Not just to me, to you. If that bullet had found its intended target instead of Rocco's shoulder—" "It didn't," Damiano said gently, pulling her closer. "And Salvatore is behind bars now, permanently, and every remaining thread of that particular danger has been resolved as thoroughly as such things can be resolved. I won't insult you by pretending my world will never produce another threat, Eleanor. That would be a lie, and I promised you honesty. But this specific war, the one that has shaped both our lives for 13 years and threatened to end them these past 2 months, this war is over. Completely, permanently over." "And what happens now?" Elena asked softly. "For us, I mean, now that the immediate danger has passed." Damiano was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally answered, his voice carried a warmth and certainty that settled something anxious and unresolved deep in Elena's chest. "Now," he said, "I would like to spend the rest of my life proving to you that everything we built these past 2 months, under the worst possible circumstances, can survive equally well under ordinary, uncomplicated ones. I would like the chance to love you through boring Tuesday evenings and grocery shopping and Nico's college applications, not just through gunfire and hospital waiting rooms. I would like, Elena Marchetti, the chance to build an entire, unremarkable, extraordinary life with you, if you'll let me." 6 weeks after Salvatore Calabrese's surrender, on a crisp Saturday afternoon in late November, Damiano Vitale did something he had not done once in his entire adult life. He asked his son for permission before making an important decision. "I want to marry your mother," he said, sitting across from Nico in the penthouse's kitchen, a location Damiano had specifically chosen because it felt, he'd decided, more honest and less theatrical than his usual, more formal spaces. "I want your blessing, Nico, genuinely, not just your acceptance. If you have any reservations at all, I want to hear them, and I want to take them seriously before I do anything else." Nico studied his father for a long moment, something warm and complicated moving across his face. "You really love her," he said. It wasn't a question. "More than I have loved anything, except you," Damiano said simply. "I know this whole situation has been a lot to absorb, Nico. Discovering your birth father, discovering the world he inhabits, nearly losing your mother twice to a war neither of you asked to be part of. If you told me right now that this was too much, that you needed more time before I brought marriage into an already complicated situation, I would listen to that, and I would wait, for as long as you needed." "I don't need you to wait," Nico said, smiling, a real, unguarded smile that reminded Damiano achingly of Sophia's easy warmth. "I've watched you these past 2 months, Dad. I've watched how you look at her. I've watched you nearly break apart with fear every time something threatened her. And I've watched you hold yourself together anyway, because she needed you to. I think—" He paused, working through the emotion clearly rising in his chest. I think she deserves someone who loves her that completely. She spent 17 years giving everything to me and never asking for anything back. I want her to have someone who gives everything back to her now. If that's you, and I think it is, then you have my blessing, completely. Damiano, a man who had faced down rival crime bosses without flinching, found himself unexpectedly, thoroughly undone by his son's blessing, blinking back tears he made no effort to hide.
"Thank you," he said, his voice rough. "That means more than you could possibly know."
"Just don't screw it up," Nico said, grinning, some of the earlier gravity dissolving into ordinary teenage teasing. "Seriously, Dad, I've had one parent my whole life who never let me down. Don't be the one who ruins the perfect streak." "I intend," Damiano said solemnly, "to spend the rest of my life making absolutely certain I don't." The proposal itself took place 3 weeks later, on Christmas Eve, a date Damiano had chosen deliberately, quietly, because it marked, nearly to the day, the anniversary of the winter night 13 years earlier, when Elena had first walked into St. Agnes Children's Home with a paper bag of second-hand toys and sat down on a cold linoleum floor beside a silent, traumatized 4-year-old boy, refusing to leave until he let her stay. He recreated that room as closely as memory and careful research could manage in a private space at the penthouse, a small, unglamorous space, deliberately plain, with a threadbare rug and simple furniture, nothing like the penthouse's usual luxury, because he wanted, more than anything, for Eleanor to understand that he'd seen and honoured the true origin of everything they'd built together, not just its glittering present. Eleanor, led into the room by Nico under the pretense of a Christmas surprise, stopped dead in the doorway, her hand flying to her mouth as she took in the careful, deliberate recreation, the cot in the corner, the paper bag of toys arranged just so, a wooden train with deliberately chipped paint, a picture book about a lighthouse, even a single, slightly bent chocolate bar. "Damiano," she breathed. "What is this?" Damiano kneeling on the floor, exactly where a 4-year-old Nico had once sat, refusing to speak to anyone until a kind stranger sat down across from him with nothing but patience and an open heart, looked up at her with tears already gathering in his eyes. "This is where it started," he said. "Not the DNA test, not the waiting room. Here. 13 years ago, in a room exactly like this one, a woman who owed my son nothing sat down on a cold floor and refused to leave until a broken little boy let her stay. Everything that happened after, everything good in both our lives, started with that single, unglamorous act of love. I wanted you to see that I understand that. I wanted you to know that whatever else I build for you, whatever penthouses or protection or promises I offer, none of it means anything if it doesn't honour the fact that you loved our son first and best and most completely, long before I ever had the chance to." He reached into his jacket and produced a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a ring so simple, so understated, that it looked almost out of place against everything else in Damiano Vitale's glittering, dangerous world. Deliberately so, Elena understood immediately. Because he had chosen it, she would learn later, specifically because it reminded him of a nurse's practical, unglamorous engagement rings, rather than anything ostentatious his world might have expected. "Elena Marchetti," Damiano said, his voice breaking with an emotion he made no effort at all to hide. You found my son when the whole world had given up looking. You raised him with a love so complete that it survived contact with a father he'd never known, a world he never asked to inherit, and a war that nearly cost you everything, twice. I have spent 38 years building an empire, and none of it, has ever meant as much to me as the chance to spend the rest of my life loving you the way you deserve to be loved. Will you marry me? Elena, tears streaming freely down her face, sank to her knees on the same threadbare rug where she had once sat with a silent, traumatized child, and found, looking into the eyes of the man who had spent 13 years searching for the son she'd raised, that the answer had never once been in doubt.
Yes, she said. Yes, Damiano. 1,000 times yes.
The wedding took place the following June, in the same Westchester estate where Nico had first met his father's family, though the guest list this time included, alongside Damiano's world, the full, boisterous chaos of Elena's 3 brothers, their wives, a dozen nieces and nephews, and a scattering of nursing colleagues who had, over the preceding months, become genuinely, warmly integrated into Nico's expanding, complicated family. Elena walked down an aisle lined with white roses, a deliberate, defiant reclamation, Damiano had explained, of a symbol that had once carried threat and now carried only the promise of a love that had survived every attempt to destroy it. Escorted by her eldest brother, her eyes fixed on the man waiting for her at the altar, with an expression of such open, unguarded joy that several guests would later admit it was the first time they had ever seen the Winter King smile without reservation. Nico stood as his father's best man, a role that had required careful, occasionally awkward negotiation about tradition and expectation, but which he'd ultimately enthusiastically embraced, delivering a toast at the reception that left very few dry eyes among the assembled guests. 17 years ago, Nico said, raising his glass, his voice steady, despite the emotion clearly rising in his chest, a nurse who had every reason to walk away from a broken, silent kid sat down on a cold floor instead and decided to stay. She didn't know who I really was. She didn't know about empires or enemies or any of the complicated things that make up my father's world. She just knew a kid needed someone, and she decided that someone would be her, no matter what it cost. I spent my whole childhood thinking I got lucky having a mum like that. I didn't understand, until this past year, exactly how much luck actually had to do with it, and exactly how much of it was just her. Her choice, over and over again, for 17 years, to love me completely, without asking for anything back. He turned to look at Damiano, standing beside Elena with his hand clasped tightly in hers. And then this guy shows up, Nico continued, grinning through visible tears, with his DNA tests and his penthouse and his absolutely terrifying capacity to end a criminal empire when someone threatens the people he loves, and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, he turns out to actually deserve her. I didn't think that was possible, honestly. I spent a long time being suspicious of that, but I've watched you both, this past year, build something real out of the wreckage of the worst thing that ever happened to our family. And I want to say, to both of you, thank you. For finding each other, for finding me, for building something worth having out of everything that tried to destroy it. He raised his glass higher. "To my mum and dad," he said, "who found each other because of me, and taught me, in the process, more about love than either of them probably realizes." The reception continued long into the night, filled with the particular glittering joy of a family finally completely whole. A joy made sweeter, Elena reflected, dancing in Damiano's arms beneath a canopy of string lights, by the knowledge of exactly how narrowly, exactly how completely, this happiness could have been lost. "Regrets?" Damiano murmured against her hair as they swayed together to music neither of them was fully listening to. "Only one," Elena said, smiling against his chest. "Which is?" "That it took 13 years and a war with a rival crime family for us to find each other," Elena said, laughing despite the gravity of what she was describing. "I could have done with a slightly less dramatic love story, Damiano Vitale." "I'll make you a promise," Damiano said, pulling back to look at her, his eyes bright with a happiness that 13 years of grief had once made seem permanently out of reach. "From this day forward, our love story gets significantly less dramatic. No more parking lot ambushes, no more charity gala assassination attempts. Just this ordinary happiness for the rest of our lives. Exactly as boring and uncomplicated as you deserve after 17 years of sacrifice." "Somehow," Elena said, "I don't entirely believe that promise. Not from a man who apparently still has an empire to run." "No," Damiano admitted, laughing, a rich, unguarded sound that had become, over the preceding months, gloriously familiar. "Probably not entirely. But I promise you this much, Elena Vitale." He tested her new name carefully, reverently, as if trying on a gift he could hardly believe he'd been given. "Whatever complications my world still brings to our door, you will never again face them alone, underestimated, or unprotected. You spent 17 years being the only wall between our sun and every danger this world could produce. I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain you never have to be that wall by yourself again." Across the dance floor, Nico watched his parents dance together, his own heart full in a way he was still learning to fully articulate, and found himself thinking, with the particular clarity of a boy who had spent his entire childhood without a father and had somehow, miraculously, ended up with two parents who loved him completely, that whatever complicated, dangerous world he'd been born into, he had also, through some strange and undeserved grace, ended up exactly where he was always meant to be. The stuffed wolf that had once sat in a glass case, a monument to 13 years of grief, now sat on a shelf in Nico's own bedroom at the penthouse, no longer a symbol of loss, but a reminder instead of exactly how far love could travel. Across 13 years and 2 lost identities and a war between empires, and still, somehow, against every reasonable expectation, find its way home. Outside, beyond the glittering lights of the Westchester estate, the city carried on its usual complicated rhythms. Its dangers and its dramas, its empires rising and falling in the shadows most ordinary people never saw. But in that one bright room, on that one perfect June evening, none of it mattered at all. Because a family that had been broken by violence and rebuilt by love was finally, completely, joyfully whole.